Application instituting proceedings. To the Registrar of the International Court of Justice, the undersigned, being duly authorized by the Government of the Republic of South Africa, state as follows. In accordance with Articles 36, 1, and 40 of the Statute of the Court and Article 38 of the Rules of Court, I have the honor to submit this application instituting proceedings in the name of the Republic of South Africa against the State of Israel. Pursuant to Article 41 of the statute, the application includes a request that the court indicate provisional measures to protect the rights invoked herein from imminent and irreparable loss. Introduction. Part 1. 1. This application concerns acts threatened, adopted, condoned, taken, and being taken by the government and military of the State of Israel against the Palestinian people, a distinct national, racial, and ethnical group, in the wake of the attacks in Israel on the 7th of October, 2023. South Africa unequivocally condemns all violations of international law by all parties, including the direct targeting of Israeli civilians and other nationals and hostage-taking by Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups. No armed attack on a state's territory, no matter how serious, even an attack involving atrocity crimes, can, however, provide any possible justification for, or defense to, breaches of the 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, Genocide Convention or Convention, whether as a matter of law or morality. The acts and omissions by Israel complained of by South Africa are genocidal in character because they are intended to bring about the destruction of a substantial part of the Palestinian national, racial, and ethnical group, that being the part of the Palestinian group in the Gaza Strip, Palestinians in Gaza. The acts in question include killing Palestinians in Gaza, causing them serious bodily and mental harm, and inflicting on them conditions of life calculated to bring about their physical destruction. The acts are all attributable to Israel, which has failed to prevent genocide and is committing genocide in manifest violation of the Genocide Convention, and which has also violated and is continuing to violate its other fundamental obligations under the Genocide Convention, including by failing to prevent or punish the direct and public incitement to genocide by senior Israeli officials and others. 2. In preparing this application, South Africa has paid close attention to the provisions of the Genocide Convention, to its interpretation, and to its application in the years following its entry into force on the 12th of January, 1951, as well as to the jurisprudence of this court and that of other international courts and tribunals, including the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda and the International Criminal Court. South Africa is highly cognizant of the fact that acts of genocide are distinct from other violations of international law sanctioned or perpetrated by the Israeli government and military in Gaza, including intentionally directing attacks against the civilian population, civilian objects and buildings dedicated to religion, education, art, science, historic monuments, hospitals, and places where the sick and wounded are collected, torture, the starvation of civilians as a method of warfare, and other war crimes and crimes against humanity, though there is often a close connection between all such acts. South Africa is also aware that acts of genocide inevitably form part of a continuum, as Raphael Lemkin, who coined the term genocide, himself recognized. For this reason, it is important to place the acts of genocide in the broader context of Israel's conduct towards Palestinians during its 75-year-long apartheid, its 56-year-long belligerent occupation of Palestinian territory and its 16-year-long blockade of Gaza, including the serious and ongoing violations of international law associated therewith, including grave breaches of the Fourth Geneva Convention, and other war crimes and crimes against humanity. However, when referring in this application to acts and omissions by Israel which are capable of amounting to other violations of international law, South Africa's case is that those acts and omissions are genocidal in character, as they are committed with the requisite specific intent, dolus specialis, to destroy Palestinians in Gaza as a part of the broader Palestinian national, racial and ethnical group. 3. South Africa is acutely aware of the particular weight of responsibility in initiating proceedings against Israel for violations of the Genocide Convention. However, South Africa is also acutely aware of its own obligation as a state party to the Genocide Convention to prevent genocide. Israel's acts and omissions in relation to Palestinians violate the Genocide Convention. That is the shared view of numerous other states parties to the convention, including the State of Palestine itself, which has called on world leaders to take responsibility to stop the genocide against our people. United Nations experts have also repeatedly sounded the alarm for over 10 weeks that considering statements made by Israeli political leaders and their allies, accompanied by military action in Gaza and escalation of arrests and killing in the West Bank, there is a risk of genocide against the Palestinian people. United Nations experts have also expressed their profound concern about the failure of the international system to mobilize to prevent genocide against Palestinians, and have called on the international community to do everything it can to immediately end the risk of genocide against the Palestinian people. The Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, CERD, acting under its Early Warning and Urgent Action Procedure, has also called on all state parties to the Genocide Convention to fully respect their obligation to prevent genocide. This application by South Africa and its request for the indication of provisional measures fall to be considered in that context and in the light of those calls. It is made against the background of South Africa's foreign policy objective for the attainment of a durable peace between Israel and the State of Palestine, with two states existing side by side within internationally recognized borders, based on those existing on 4 June, 1967, prior to the outbreak of the 1967 Arab-Israeli War, in line with all relevant United Nations resolutions and international law. 4. The facts relied on by South Africa in this application and to be further developed in these proceedings establish that against a background of apartheid, expulsion, ethnic cleansing, annexation, occupation, discrimination, and the ongoing denial of the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination, Israel, since the 7th of October, 2023 in particular, has failed to prevent genocide and has failed to prosecute the direct and public incitement to genocide. More gravely still, Israel has engaged in, is engaging in and risks further engaging in genocidal acts against the Palestinian people in Gaza. Those acts include killing them, causing them serious mental and bodily harm and deliberately inflicting on them conditions of life calculated to bring about their physical destruction as a group. Repeated statements by Israeli state representatives, including at the highest levels, by the Israeli President, Prime Minister, and Minister of Defense express genocidal intent. That intent is also properly to be inferred from the nature and conduct of Israel's military operation in Gaza, having regard inter alia to Israel's failure to provide or ensure essential food, water, medicine, fuel, shelter and other humanitarian assistance for the besieged and blockaded Palestinian people, which has pushed them to the brink of famine. It is also clear from the nature, scope and extent of Israel's military attacks on Gaza, which have involved the sustained bombardment over more than 11 weeks of one of the most densely populated places in the world, forcing the evacuation of 1.9 million people or 85% of the population of Gaza from their homes and herding them into ever smaller areas, without adequate shelter, in which they continue to be attacked, killed and harmed. Israel has now killed in excess of 21,110 named Palestinians, including over 7,729 children with over 7,780 others missing, presumed dead under the rubble, and has injured over 55,243 other Palestinians, causing them severe bodily and mental harm. Israel has also laid waste to vast areas of Gaza, including entire neighborhoods, and has damaged or destroyed in excess of 355,000 Palestinian homes, alongside extensive tracts of agricultural land, bakeries, schools, universities, businesses, places of worship, cemeteries, cultural and archaeological sites, municipal and court buildings, and critical infrastructure, including water and sanitation facilities and electricity networks, while pursuing a relentless assault on the Palestinian medical and healthcare system. Israel has reduced and is continuing to reduce Gaza to rubble, killing, harming and destroying its people, and creating conditions of life calculated to bring about their physical destruction as a group. 5. South Africa, mindful of the just Kogan's character of the prohibition of genocide and the Erga Omnes Party's character of the obligations owed by states under the Genocide Convention, is making the present application to establish Israel's responsibility for violations of the Genocide Convention, to hold it fully accountable under international law for those violations, and most immediately to have recourse to this court to ensure the urgent and fullest possible protection for Palestinians in Gaza who remain at grave and immediate risk of continuing and further acts of genocide. 6. In light of the extraordinary urgency of the situation, South Africa seeks an expedited hearing for its request for the indication of provisional measures. In addition, pursuant to Article 74(4) of the Rules of Court, South Africa requests the President of the Court to protect the Palestinian people in Gaza by calling upon Israel immediately to halt all military attacks that constitute or give rise to violations of the Genocide Convention pending the holding of such hearing, so as to enable any order the Court may make on the request for the indication of provisional measures to have its appropriate effects. To that end, the Court should order Israel to cease killing and causing serious mental and bodily harm to Palestinian people in Gaza, to cease the deliberate infliction of conditions of life calculated to bring about their physical destruction as a group, to prevent and punish direct and public incitement to genocide, and to rescind related policies and practices, including regarding the restriction on aid and the issuing of evacuation directives. 7. Mindful of the Court's important role and the exercise of its grave responsibility in circumstances in which the genocidal acts of which South Africa complains have occurred very recently and are ongoing and have not otherwise been subject to judicial determination or detailed fact-finding, South Africa's application and request for provisional measures provide a more detailed factual account than might otherwise be usual. That account draws in significant part on statements and reports by United Nations chiefs and bodies and non-governmental organizations, NGOs, as well as eyewitness accounts from Gaza, including from Palestinian journalists on the ground in circumstances where Israel continues to restrict access to Gaza by international journalists, investigators, and fact-finding teams. However, neither the application nor the request for the indication of provisional measures depends on a determination by the Court of each individual incident or complaint referred to herein. Notably, as the Court's case law makes clear, what the Court is required to do at the stage of making an order on provisional measures is to establish whether, at least some of the acts alleged, are capable of falling within the provisions of the Convention. 8. At least some of the acts alleged by South Africa are clearly capable of falling within those provisions. Part 2. Jurisdiction of the Court. 8. South Africa and Israel are both members of the United Nations and therefore bound by the statute of the Court, including Article 36(1), which provides that the Court's jurisdiction comprises all matters specially provided for in treaties and conventions in force. 9. South Africa and Israel are also parties to the Genocide Convention. Israel signed the Genocide Convention on 17 August, 1949 and deposited its instrument of ratification on 9 March, 1950, thereby becoming a party when the Genocide Convention entered into force on 12 January, 1951. South Africa deposited its instrument of accession on 10 December, 1998. It became applicable between the parties on the 90th day thereafter, pursuant to Article 13 of the Convention. 10. Article 9 of the Genocide Convention provides disputes between the contracting parties relating to the interpretation, application, or fulfillment of the present Convention, including those relating to the responsibility of a state for genocide or for any of the other acts enumerated in Article 3, shall be submitted to the International Court of Justice at the request of any of the parties to the dispute. 11. Neither South Africa nor Israel has entered any reservation to Article 9. 12. South Africa has repeatedly and urgently expressed its concerns and condemnation in respect of Israel's acts and omissions which form the basis of this application. South Africa and other states parties to the Genocide Convention have, in particular, made clear that Israel's actions in Gaza constitute genocide against the Palestinian people. By way of example, the presidents of Algeria, Bolivia, Brazil, Colombia, Cuba, Iran, Turkey, and Venezuela have all described Israel's actions as a genocide, as has the Palestinian president. State officials and representatives from Bangladesh, Egypt, Honduras, Iraq, Jordan, Libya, Malaysia, Namibia, Pakistan, Syria, and Tunisia, have also referred to genocide or the risk thereof in Gaza, as have heads of state and state officials from non-state parties to the Genocide Convention, including Qatar and Mauritania. Speaking on behalf of the Arab group at the 9498th meeting of the United Nations Security Council on 8 December, 2023, ahead of the United Nations Security Council vote on a ceasefire, Egypt's representative stated that the civilian fatalities in Gaza lay bare the lie that the war is against an armed group. Rather, it is a collective punishment and genocide against the Palestinian people. Citing the extensive destruction of civilian infrastructure and the targeting of United Nations staff members, he stated that the forcible displacement of 85% of Gaza's people, living in dire circumstances, represents an effort to eliminate the Palestinian people. 13. Having regard to the fact that the prohibition of genocide has the character of a peremptory norm and that the obligations under the Convention are owed erga omnes and erga omnes parties, Israel has been made fully aware of the grave concerns expressed by the international community, by states parties to the Genocide Convention, and by South Africa in particular, as to Israel's failure to cease, prevent and punish the commission of genocide. South Africa's concern has been expressed, inter alia, as follows. On the 30th of October, 2023, the South African Department of International Relations and Cooperation issued a statement calling on the international community to hold Israel accountable for breaches of international law. Warning that the crime of genocide, sadly looms large in Gaza, the statement recalled that President Lula da Silva of Brazil has called the attacks on Gaza a genocide and that the South African Minister of International Relations and Cooperation, Naledi Pandya, addressing the United Nations Security Council on the 24th of October, 2023, had also reminded the international community not to stand idle while another genocide is unfolding. On the 7th of November, addressing the South African National Assembly, South Africa's International Relations Minister warned that the crime of genocide sadly looms large in the current situation in Gaza, recalling that in 1994, a genocide occurred on the African continent with much of the whole world watching as innocent people were massacred, and underscoring that South Africa could not stand by and allow that to happen again. On the 10th of November, 2023, the Director General of South Africa's Department of International Relations and Cooperation, DIRCO, conducted a formal diplomatic démarche of the ambassador of the State of Israel to South Africa, advising him that while South Africa condemned the attacks on civilians by Hamas which should be investigated for war crimes, the response by Israel was unlawful, and that South Africa wants the ICC to investigate the leadership of Israel for crimes including genocide. On the 13th of November, 2023, at a meeting at the presidential residence with the leadership of the South African Jewish Board of Deputies, at which they called inter alia for the reopening of the South African Embassy in Israel, the President of South Africa, Mr. Cyril Ramaphosa condemned the genocide that is being inflicted against the people of Palestine, including women and children, through collective punishment and ongoing bombardment of Gaza. On the 17th of November, 2023, during the course of a state visit to Qatar, the President of South Africa announced that South Africa was referring the situation in the state of Palestine to the International Criminal Court, expressing his abhorrence for what is happening right now in Gaza, which has now turned into a concentration camp where genocide is taking place. Later on the 17th of November, 2023, the Embassy of South Africa in The Hague, acting on behalf of South Africa, jointly with 3 other states parties to the Genocide Convention, namely Bangladesh, Bolivia, and Comoros and Djibouti, referred the situation in the state of Palestine to the Office of the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, requesting that the prosecutor vigorously investigate crimes within the jurisdictional scope of the court, including the crime of genocide, as provided for in Article 6, A, B, and C, of the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, Rome Statute. On the 21st of November, 2023, addressing the extraordinary joint meeting of BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, leaders of invited BRICS members on the situation in the Middle East called to address a matter of grave global concern in the Middle East. The President of South Africa asserted that the deliberate denial of medicine, fuel, food and water to the residents of Gaza is tantamount to genocide. On the 12th of December, 2023, speaking at the 10th Emergency Special Session of the United Nations General Assembly, at which Israel was represented, the South African ambassador to the United Nations stated that the events of the past 6 weeks in Gaza have illustrated that Israel is acting contrary to its obligations in terms of the Genocide Convention. She underscored that, as a UN member state and owing to South Africa's painful past experience of a system of apartheid, this impresses on us, as member states, to take action in accordance with international law. On the 21st of December, 2023, South Africa sent a note verbale to the Embassy of Israel in South Africa, in which South Africa raised its concerns about credible reports that acts meeting the threshold of genocide or related crimes as defined in the 1948 Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide, have been and may still be committed in the context of the conflict in Gaza. The note verbale recalled that as a state party to the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, South Africa is under a treaty obligation to prevent genocide from occurring, and therefore calls upon Israel, which is also a state party to the Convention, to immediately cease hostilities in Gaza and to refrain from conduct constituting or failing to prevent violations of its obligations under the Convention. South Africa, alarmed by rhetoric from Israeli officials and others, also called on Israel to prevent and punish direct and public incitement to genocide. This served to communicate directly to Israel South Africa's claims regarding the fulfillment of its own obligations under the Genocide Convention and breaches by Israel of its obligations under the Genocide Convention and the detail thereof. 14. Israel has not responded directly to South Africa's note verbale sent on the 21st of December, 2023. However, Israel has publicly rejected any suggestion that it has violated international law in its military campaign in Gaza. Notably, Israel has dismissed as outrageous and false the assertion that Israel's military attacks on Gaza meet the legal definition of genocide and are aimed at not just simply the killing of innocent people and the destruction of their livelihoods but a systematic effort to empty Gaza of its people. Israel denies that its conduct in Gaza violates its obligations under the Genocide Convention, asserting that the accusation of genocide against Israel is not only wholly unfounded as a matter of fact and law, it is morally repugnant and anti-Semitic. 43. Moreover, Israel has engaged and continues to engage in acts and omissions against the Palestinian people in Gaza as have been asserted to be genocidal and, by its attitude and conduct, has refuted any suggestion that its actions in Gaza are constrained by its obligations under the Genocide Convention. Indeed, the Israeli Prime Minister asserted on the 26th of December, 2023, "We are not stopping. We are continuing to fight, and we are deepening the fighting in the coming days, and this will be a long battle and it is not close to being over." Israel's own conduct therefore serves to underline the parties' disagreement. South Africa has not resiled from its own position that it is responsible as a state party to the Genocide Convention to act to prevent genocide or a risk thereof in Gaza. 15. According to the established case law of the court, a dispute is a disagreement on a point of law or fact, a conflict of legal views or interests between parties. Such a disagreement or positive opposition of the claim by one party by the other need not necessarily be stated expressis verbis. The position or the attitude of a party can be established by inference, whatever the professed view of that party. 16. There is plainly a dispute between Israel and South Africa relating to the interpretation and application of the Genocide Convention, going both to South Africa's compliance with its own obligation to prevent genocide, and to Israel's compliance with its obligations not to commit genocide and to prevent and punish genocide, including the direct and public incitement to genocide, and to make reparations to its victims and offer assurances and guarantees of non-repetition. Given that South Africa's claim concerns its own obligations as a state party to the Genocide Convention to act to prevent genocide, to which Israel's acts and omissions give rise, South Africa plainly has standing in relation thereto. Moreover, given that any state party to the Genocide Convention, and not only a specially affected state, may invoke the responsibility of another state party with a view to ascertaining the alleged failure to comply with its obligations erga omnes partes, and to bring that failure to an end. South Africa also has prima facie standing to submit to the court its dispute with Israel on the basis of alleged violations of obligations under the Genocide Convention. 17. Therefore, pursuant to Article 36(1) of the Court Statute and Article 9 of the Genocide Convention, the Court has jurisdiction to hear the claims submitted in the present application by South Africa against Israel. Part 3. The Facts. A. Introduction. 18. Since the 7th of October, 2023, Israel has engaged in a large-scale military assault by land, air, and sea, on the Gaza Strip, Gaza, a narrow strip of land approximately of 365 square kilometers, one of the most densely populated places in the world. Gaza, home to approximately 2.3 million people, almost half of them children, has been subjected by Israel to what has been described as one of the heaviest conventional bombing campaigns in the history of modern warfare. By the 29th of October, 2023 alone, it was estimated that 6,000 bombs per week had been dropped on the tiny enclave. In just over 2 months, Israel's military attacks had wreaked more destruction than the razing of Syria's Aleppo between 2012 and 2016, Ukraine's Mariupol, or proportionally, the Allied bombing of Germany in World War II. The destruction wrought by Israel is so extreme that Gaza is now a different color from space. It's a different texture. As stated by the United Nations Secretary-General, in a letter dated the 6th of December, 2023 to the President of the United Nations Security Council, of which the United Nations General Assembly took express note in Resolution ESIO 22 of the 12th of December, 2023 on the protection of civilians and upholding legal and humanitarian obligations. Civilians throughout Gaza face grave danger. Since the start of Israel's military operation, more than 15,000 people have reportedly been killed, over 40% of whom were children. Thousands of others have been injured. More than half of all homes have been destroyed. Some 80% of the population of 2.2 million has been forcibly displaced, into increasingly smaller areas. More than 1.1 million people have sought refuge in UNRWA facilities across Gaza, creating overcrowded, undignified, and unhygienic conditions. Others have nowhere to shelter and find themselves on the street. Explosive remnants of war are rendering areas uninhabitable. There is no effective protection of civilians. The healthcare system in Gaza is collapsing. Hospitals have turned into battlegrounds. Only 14 hospitals out of 36 facilities are even partially functional. The 2 major hospitals in South Gaza are operating at 3 times their bed capacity and are running out of basic supplies and fuel. They are also sheltering thousands of displaced persons. Under these circumstances, more people will die untreated in the coming days and weeks. Nowhere is safe in Gaza. Amid constant bombardment by the Israel Defense Forces, and without shelter or the essentials to survive, I expect public order to completely break down soon due to the desperate conditions, rendering even limited humanitarian assistance impossible. An even worse situation could unfold, including epidemic diseases and increased pressure for mass displacement into neighboring countries. While delivery of supplies through Rafah continues, quantities are insufficient and have dropped since the pause came to an end. We are simply unable to reach those in need inside Gaza. We are facing a severe risk of collapse of the humanitarian system. The situation is fast deteriorating into a catastrophe with potentially irreversible implications for Palestinians as a whole and for peace and security in the region. Such an outcome must be avoided at all cost. 19. Since that letter was written, the numbers have risen even more starkly. At least 21,110 Palestinians in Gaza have been killed and over 243 other Palestinians have been wounded, many severely. The death toll includes over 7,729 children, not including the 4,700 women and children still missing, and presumed dead under the rubble. Entire multi-generational families have been wiped out completely. Over 355,000 homes, equivalent to more than 60% of Gaza's housing stock in Gaza, has been damaged or destroyed. 1.9 million Palestinians, approximately 85% of the total population, have been internally displaced. Many fled the north of the territory to the south, having been ordered to do so by Israel, only to be bombed again in the south, and told to flee once again further south or the southwest, where they are reduced to living in makeshift tents in camps with no water, sanitation, or other facilities. Israel has bombed, shelled, and besieged Gaza's hospitals, with only 13 out of 36 hospitals partially functional, and no fully functioning hospital left in North Gaza. 62 Gaza's healthcare system has all but collapsed, with reports of operations, including amputations and caesarean sections, taking place without anesthetic. A significant proportion of the wounded and sick are unable to access any or adequate care. Contagious and epidemic diseases are rife amongst the displaced Palestinian population, with experts warning of the risk of meningitis, cholera, and other outbreaks. The entire population in Gaza is at imminent risk of famine, whereas the proportion of households affected by acute food insecurity is the largest ever recorded according to the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, IPC. Experts warn that silent, slow deaths caused by hunger and thirst risk surpassing those violent deaths already caused by Israeli bombs and missiles. 20. The United Nations General Assembly has expressed grave concern over the catastrophic humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip and the suffering of the Palestinian civilian population, with the United Nations Security Council noting in particular the disproportionate effect on children. In its resolution ES 1022 of 12 December, 2023, the United Nations General Assembly also took express note of a letter dated 7 December, 2023 from the Commissioner General of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East, UNRWA, addressed to the President of the General Assembly. In the unprecedented letter, the Commissioner General predicts the collapse of the mandate he is expected to fulfill and calls for an end to the decimation of Gaza and of its people. B. Background 1. The Gaza Strip, Gaza. 21. Gaza is a narrow strip of land, bordered to the west by the Mediterranean Sea, to the south by Egypt and to the north and east by Israel. Together with the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, it is one of the two constituent territories of the occupied Palestinian territory, OPT, occupied by Israel in 1967 and of the State of Palestine, recognized by South Africa on 15 February, 1995, and accorded non-member observer state status in the United Nations on 29 November, 2012. 22. The population of Gaza consists of approximately 2.3 million people, over half of whom are children. 80% of Palestinians in Gaza are refugees and their descendants from towns and villages in what is now the State of Israel, expelled or forced to flee during the mass displacement of over 750,000 Palestinians or Nakba during the establishment of the State of Israel. The Nakba and the mass displacement associated with it therefore features prominently in the history and consciousness of Palestinians in Gaza, as it does for the wider Palestinian people. Palestinians in Gaza form a substantial part of the Palestinian national, racial, and ethnical group. They are a prominent part of the group, making up the population of one of the two constituent territories of the State of Palestine. They are also a quantitatively substantial part of the Palestinian population of the State of Palestine under occupation, which counts approximately 5.48 million people. 23. Gaza comprises 5 governorates. The Gaza North and Gaza governorates constituting the north stretch from the north of Wadi Gaza towards Erez Crossing, a pedestrian crossing into Israel, also known as the Beit Hanoun crossing. The north is ordinarily home to approximately 1 million Palestinians, many concentrated in Gaza City, approximately 713,488 inhabitants, as well as in Beit Lahia and Beit Hanoun, and in the Beach and Jabalia refugee camps. It is where Gaza's largest hospital, Al-Shifa Medical Hospital, is situated, as well as the Kamal Adwan Hospital. The Deir al-Bala Governorate, the middle area, ordinarily counts 302,507 inhabitants, primarily in Deir al-Bala city, as well as in the Al-Maghazi, and Nuzirat, al-Buri and Deir al-Bala refugee camps. It is where Gaza's only power plant is located. The Khan Yunis and Rafah governorates, the south, are below Deir al-Bala Governorate and extend to the Rafah crossing with Egypt. The major population centers in the south are Khan Yunis and Rafah, as well as the Khan Yunis and Rafah refugee camps. The Karem Shalom crossing, also known as Karem Abu Salem crossing, is located 4 km west of Rafah. The south is where the Nasser Hospital is located. The South's pre-October 2023 population stood at approximately 673,844 inhabitants. The middle area and the South now accommodate more than 1.2 million internally displaced persons in 98 UNRWA facilities, and tens of thousands in makeshift tents in Al-Mawasi area, a Bedouin Palestinian town in a small strip of mostly undeveloped sand along Gaza's Mediterranean coast, identified by Israel on the resumption of hostilities in the first week of December 2023 as a purportedly safe zone. Around 160,000 more displaced Palestinians are believed to remain in UNRWA facilities in the north, as well as others sheltering in other locations. 24. Until 2005, Gaza, like the West Bank today, was occupied by Israeli military forces on the ground. However, in 2005, Israel unilaterally disengaged from Gaza, dismantling its military bases and relocating Israeli settlers from settlements in Gaza back to Israel and into the occupied West Bank. 85. Notwithstanding its disengagement, Israel continues to exercise control over the airspace, territorial waters, land crossings, water, electricity, electromagnetic sphere and civilian infrastructure in Gaza. 86. As well as over key governmental functions, such as the management of the Palestinian Population Registry for Gaza. Given that continuing effective control by Israel over the territory, Gaza is still considered by the international community to be under belligerent occupation by Israel. The near-total control exercised by Israel over access to Gaza, and over its water, fuel, electricity and food supplies, has been demonstrated starkly since the 7th of October, 2023. 25. Entry and exit by air and sea to Gaza has been prohibited since the early 1990s, with Israel operating only 2 crossing points, Erez, pedestrian, and Kerem Shalom, goods, through which Palestinians in Gaza could access the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, for business, trade, healthcare and social and family functions. However, Israel imposed a stringent blockade of Gaza, following Hamas' electoral victory in 2006 that was followed by inter-Palestinian violence, declaring the entire territory to be a hostile territory. Existing restrictions on the movement of persons were significantly tightened, with most Palestinians in Gaza being ineligible for permits to travel, leading to prolonged, indefinite separation for many Palestinian families. The few who were eligible to travel did not necessarily receive permits and almost always encountered delays and difficulties in the process. Between 2008 and 2021, the World Health Organization, WHO, recorded that 839 Palestinians from Gaza had died while waiting for medical permits to leave Gaza for urgent medical treatment. The majority of permits were for day laborers and agricultural traders, primarily to undertake low-skilled work in Israel and on Israeli settlements in the West Bank. Between 2007 and 2010, Israel regulated food imports into Gaza in accordance with calories consumed per person, to limit the transfers of food to a humanitarian minimum, without causing hunger or malnutrition. Israel thereafter applied a dual-use system to imports into Gaza, severely restricting the entry of goods by prohibiting goods considered to be capable of having a dual civilian military use. 26. Israel's parallel implementation of a wide buffer zone inside Gaza's eastern border fence, estimated to restrict access to approximately 24% of Gaza, severely impacts internal food supply, by reducing the main agricultural area for farming. Israel also made fishing extremely hazardous for Palestinians, who have not had full access to the fishing zone of 20 nautical miles stipulated in the Oslo Accords interim agreements concluded between the PLO and Israel in the early 1990s. The naval blockade policed by Israeli forces through the use of force, arrests and the confiscation of fishing equipment severely reduced the fishing catchment area for Gaza's fishermen to polluted waters immediately off the coastline, leading to overfishing impacting sustainability. 98 As long ago as 2015, the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD, warned that the restrictive measures imposed by Israel risked Gaza becoming uninhabitable by 2020. In 2020, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Palestinian territories occupied since 1967 described the impact of Israel's blockade on Gaza as having turned Gaza from a low-income society with modest but growing export ties to the regional and international economy to an impoverished ghetto with a decimated economy and a collapsing social service system. In 2022, he described the situation as follows. In Gaza, the apparent strategy of Israel is the indefinite warehousing of an unwanted population of 2 million Palestinians, whom it has confined to a narrow strip of land through its comprehensive 15-year-old air, land, and sea blockade, with further restrictions by Egypt on the southern border of Gaza. Ban Ki-moon has called this political quarantining of the population a collective punishment, which is a serious breach of international law. The World Bank reported in 2021 that Gaza had undergone a multi-decade process of de-development and deindustrialization, resulting in a 45% unemployment rate and a 60% poverty rate, with 80% of the population dependent on some form of international assistance, in significant part because of the hermetic sealing of the access of Gaza to the outside world. The coastal aquifer, the sole source of natural drinking water in Gaza, has become polluted and unfit for human consumption because of contamination by seawater and sewage, substantially driving up water costs for an already destitute population. Gaza is heavily dependent on external sources Israel and Egypt for power, and Palestinians live with rolling power blackouts of between 12 and 20 hours daily, severely impairing daily living and the economy. The entry and export of goods is strictly controlled by Israel, which has throttled the local economy. The healthcare system in Gaza is flat on its back, with serious shortages of healthcare professionals, inadequate treatment equipment and low supplies of drugs and medicines. Palestinians in Gaza can rarely travel outside of Gaza, which is a denial of their fundamental right to freedom of movement. More acutely, they have endured 4 highly asymmetrical wars with Israel over the past 13 years, with enormous loss of civilian life and immense property destruction. The suffering was acknowledged by Antonio Guterres in May 2021, when he stated, "If there is a hell on earth, it is the lives of children in Gaza." 27. Between the 29th of September, 2000 and the 7th of October, 2023, approximately 7,569 Palestinians, 102 including 1,699 children, were killed, including in those 4 highly asymmetrical wars, as well as other smaller military assaults, with tens of thousands of others injured. A further 214 Palestinians, including 46 children, were killed during the Great March of Return, a large-scale peaceful protest along the separation fence between Gaza and Israel, in which thousands of Palestinians participated every Friday for over 18 months, demanding that the blockade imposed on Gaza be lifted and the return of Palestinian refugees to their homes and villages in Israel. On one particularly lethal day alone, Israel killed 60 Palestinian protesters. As determined by the Independent Commission of Inquiry on the Protests in the Occupied Palestinian Territory, Commission. During these weekly demonstrations, the Israeli Security Forces, ISF, killed and gravely injured civilians who were neither participating directly in hostilities nor posing an imminent threat to life. Among those shot were children, paramedics, journalists, and persons with disabilities. 28. Those killed by Israeli soldiers, firing from behind the separation fence, included 3 medics and 2 journalists. A total of over 36,100 Palestinians, including nearly 8,800 children, were injured by Israel, including 4,903 people who were shot in the lower limbs, many while standing hundreds of meters away from the snipers, unarmed. 156 of them had to have at least one limb amputated, and over 1,200 required specialized limb reconstruction treatment. The Commission found that the maiming was not accidental. The rules of engagement adopted by Israel permitted snipers to shoot at the legs of the major inciters. One Israeli soldier admitted that he shot 42 knees in one day. 29. The Commission found that there were reasonable grounds to believe that Israeli snipers intentionally shot children, knowing them to be children, and they also intentionally shot health workers and journalists despite seeing that they were clearly marked as such. It further found reasonable grounds to believe that Israeli snipers shot disabled demonstrators intentionally, despite seeing that they had visible disabilities and despite them not presenting an imminent threat. 30. Other reports by United Nations bodies and mandates have repeatedly found Israel to have acted in serious violation of international law in its previous military attacks on Gaza. By way of example, report of the Human Rights Inquiry Commission established pursuant to Commission Resolution S51 of 19 October, 2000, 16 March, 2001 1750. The IDF, apparently on grounds of military necessity, has destroyed homes and laid to waste a significant amount of agricultural land, especially in Gaza, which is already land-starved. Statistics show that 94 homes have been demolished and 7,024 dunams of agricultural land bulldozed in Gaza. Damage to private houses is put at $9.5 million and damage to agricultural land at about $27 million. Houses situated on this land had been destroyed and families compelled to live in tents. Water wells in the vicinity had also been completely destroyed. The Commission found it difficult to believe that such destruction, generally carried out in the middle of the night and without advance warning, was justified on grounds of military necessity. To the Commission it seemed that such destruction of property had been carried out in an intimidatory manner unrelated to security, disrespectful of civilian well-being and going well beyond the needs of military necessity. The evidence suggests that destruction of property and demolition of houses have been replicated elsewhere in the West Bank and Gaza. Palestinians, like other people, are deeply attached to their homes and agricultural land. The demolition of homes and the destruction of olive and citrus trees, nurtured by farmers over many years, has caused untold human suffering to persons unconnected with the present violence. The Commission concludes that the IDF has engaged in the excessive use of force at the expense of life and property in Palestine. Report of the high-level fact-finding mission to Beit Hanoun established under Council Resolution S31, 1 September, 2008, Archbishop Desmond Tutu and Professor Christine Chinkin. The mission expresses its sympathy to all victims of the shelling on 8 November, 2006 of Beit Hanoun. The attack took lives, inflicted horrendous physical and mental injuries, tore families apart, destroyed homes, took away livelihoods and traumatized a population. Its aftermath compounded those ills. In the absence of a well-founded explanation from the Israeli military, who is in sole possession of the relevant facts, the mission must conclude that there is a possibility that the shelling of Beit Hanoun constituted a war crime as defined in the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court. One victim of the Beit Hanoun shelling was the rule of law. There has been no accountability for an act that killed 19 people and injured many more. Report of the United Nations fact-finding mission on the Gaza conflict established pursuant to Human Rights Council Resolution S91 of 12 January, 2009, 25 September, 2009. The mission did not find any evidence to support the allegations that hospital facilities were used by the Gaza authorities or by Palestinian armed groups to shield military activities or that ambulances were used to transport combatants or for other military purposes. On the basis of its own investigations and the statements by United Nations officials, the mission excludes that Palestinian armed groups engaged in combat activities from United Nations facilities that were used as shelters during the military operations. The mission investigated 4 incidents in which the Israeli armed forces coerced Palestinian civilian men at gunpoint to take part in house searches during the military operations. The mission concludes that this practice amounts to the use of Palestinian civilians as human shields and is therefore prohibited by international humanitarian law. The Palestinian men used as human shields were questioned under threat of death or injury to extract information about Hamas, Palestinian combatants, and tunnels. This constitutes a further violation of international humanitarian law. In addition to arbitrary deprivation of liberty and violation of due process rights, the cases of the detained Palestinian civilians highlight a common thread of the interaction between Israeli soldiers and Palestinian civilians, which also emerged clearly in many cases discussed elsewhere in the report: continuous and systematic abuse, outrages on personal dignity, humiliating and degrading treatment contrary to fundamental principles of international humanitarian law and human rights law. The mission concludes that this treatment constitutes the infliction of a collective penalty on these civilians and amounts to measures of intimidation and terror. In assessing the Israeli strikes against the Legislative Council building and the main prison, the mission first of all notes that Hamas is an organization with distinct political, military, and social welfare components. The mission rejects the analysis of present and former senior Israeli officials that, because of the alleged nature of the Hamas government in Gaza, the distinction between civilian and military parts of the government infrastructure is no longer relevant in relation to Israel's conflict with Hamas. The mission is of the view that this is a dangerous argument that should be vigorously rejected as incompatible with the cardinal principle of distinction. International humanitarian law prohibits attacks against targets that do not make an effective contribution to military action. Attacks that are not directed against military, or dual-use, objectives are violations of the laws of war, no matter how promising the attacker considers them from a strategic or political point of view. The warning to go to city centers came at the start of the ground invasion. In the mission's view, it was unreasonable to assume, in the circumstances, that civilians would indeed leave their homes. As a consequence, the conclusion that allegedly formed part of the logic of soldiers on the ground that those who had stayed put had to be combatants was wholly unwarranted. Taking into account the weapons used, and in particular the use of white phosphorus in and around a hospital that the Israeli armed forces knew was not only dealing with scores of injured and wounded but also giving shelter to several hundred civilians, the mission finds, based on all the information available to it, that in directly striking the hospital and the ambulance depot the Israeli armed forces in these circumstances violated Article 18 of the Fourth Geneva Convention and violated customary international law in relation to proportionality. The mission found that the systematic destruction of food, production, water services, and construction industries was related to the overall policy of disproportionate destruction of a significant part of Gaza's infrastructure. Through its overly broad framing of the supporting infrastructure, the Israeli armed forces have sought to construct a scope for their activities that, in the mission's view, was designed to have inevitably dire consequences for the non-combatants in Gaza. Statements by political and military leaders prior to and during the military operations in Gaza leave little doubt that disproportionate destruction and violence against civilians were part of a deliberate policy. The Gaza military operations were, according to the Israeli government, thoroughly and extensively planned. While the Israeli government has sought to portray its operations as essentially a response to rocket attacks in the exercise of its right to self-defense, the mission considers the plan to have been directed, at least in part, at a different target: the people of Gaza as a whole. The mission recognizes fully that the Israeli armed forces, like any army attempting to act within the parameters of international law, must avoid taking undue risks with their soldiers' lives, but neither can they transfer that risk onto the lives of civilian men, women, and children. The fundamental principles of distinction and proportionality apply on the battlefield, whether that battlefield is a built-up urban area or an open field. The repeated failure to distinguish between combatants and civilians appears to the mission to have been the result of deliberate guidance issued to soldiers, as described by some of them, and not the result of occasional lapses. It is clear from evidence gathered by the mission that the destruction of food supply installations, water sanitation systems, concrete factories, and residential houses was the result of a deliberate and systematic policy by the Israeli armed forces. It was not carried out because those objects presented a military threat or opportunity, but to make the daily process of living, and dignified living, more difficult for the civilian population. Allied to the systematic destruction of the economic capacity of the Gaza Strip, there appears also to have been an assault on the dignity of the people. This was seen not only in the use of human shields and unlawful detention sometimes in unacceptable conditions, but also in the vandalizing of houses when occupied and the way in which people were treated when their houses were entered. The graffiti on the walls, the obscenities, and often racist slogans, all constituted an overall image of humiliation and dehumanization of the Palestinian population. The operations were carefully planned in all their phases. Legal opinions and advice were given throughout the planning stages and at certain operational levels during the campaign. There were almost no mistakes made according to the government of Israel. It's in these circumstances that the mission concludes that what occurred in just over 3 weeks at the end of 2008 and the beginning of 2009 was a deliberately disproportionate attack designed to punish, humiliate, and terrorize a civilian population, radically diminish its local economic capacity both to work and to provide for itself, and to force upon it an ever-increasing sense of dependency and vulnerability. The mission found that the Israeli armed forces in Gaza rounded up and detained large groups of persons protected under the Fourth Geneva Convention. The mission finds that their detention cannot be justified either as detention of unlawful combatants or as internment of civilians for imperative reasons of security. The mission also finds that the Israeli armed forces unlawfully and wantonly attacked and destroyed without military necessity a number of food production or food processing objects and facilities, including mills, land and greenhouses, drinking water installations, farms and animals in violation of the principle of distinction. From the facts ascertained by it, the mission finds that this destruction was carried out with the purpose of denying sustenance to the civilian population, in violation of customary law reflected in Article 54(2) of the First Additional Protocol. The mission further concludes that the Israeli armed forces carried out widespread destruction of private residential houses, water wells, and water tanks unlawfully and wantonly. Report of the Independent Commission of Inquiry established pursuant to Human Rights Council Resolution S21-1, the 24th of June, 2015. The large number of targeted attacks against residential buildings and the fact that such attacks continued throughout the operation, even after the dire impact of these attacks on civilians and civilian objects became apparent, raise concern that the strikes may have constituted military tactics reflective of a broader policy, approved at least tacitly by decision-makers at the highest levels of the government of Israel. The fact that the Israel Defense Forces did not modify the manner in which they conducted their operations after initial episodes of shelling resulted in a large number of civilian deaths indicates that their policies governing the use of artillery in densely populated areas may not be in conformity with international humanitarian law. Destruction by artillery fire, airstrikes, and bulldozers may have been adopted as a tactic of war. Some destruction may arguably be the result of the legitimate attempts of the Israel Defense Forces to dismantle tunnels and to protect its soldiers. The concentration of destruction in localities close to the Green Line, in some areas amounting to 100%, and the systematic way in which these areas were flattened one after the other, however, raise concerns that such extensive destruction was not required by imperative military necessity. If confirmed, this would constitute a grave breach of Article 147 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, which is a war crime. Warnings to evacuate were meant to create sterile combat zones, and the people remaining in the area would no longer be considered civilians and thus benefit from the protection afforded by their civilian status. For example, the head of the doctrine desk at the Infantry Corps headquarters reportedly stated, "In peacetime security, soldiers stand facing a civilian population, but in wartime, there is no civilian population, just an enemy." Inferring that anyone remaining in an area that has been the object of a warning is an enemy or a person engaging in terrorist activity, or issuing instructions to this effect, contributes to creating an environment conducive to attacks against civilians. Those civilians choosing not to heed a warning do not lose the protection granted by their status. The only way in which civilians lose their protection from attack is by directly participating in the hostilities. Merely issuing a warning does not absolve the Israel Defense Forces of their legal obligations to protect civilian life. An examination of actions by the Israel Defense Forces in Shuja'iyah in July and Rafah on 1 August indicates that the protection of Israeli soldiers significantly influenced the conduct of the Israel Defense Forces in these operations, at times overriding any concern for minimizing civilian casualties. While force protection is a legitimate objective, the Commission has the distinct impression that, when soldiers' lives were at stake or there was a risk of capture, the Commission believes that the military culture created by such policy priorities may have been a factor contributing to the decision to unleash massive firepower in Rafah and Shuja'iyah, in utter disregard of its devastating impact on the civilian population. Moreover, applying this protocol in the context of a densely populated environment through the use of heavy weaponry predictably leads to violations of the principles of distinction and proportionality. Report of the detailed findings of the Independent Commission of Inquiry established pursuant to Human Rights Council Resolution S21-1 of 23 July, 2014, 24 June, 2015. The sheer number of shells fired, as well as the reported dropping of over 101-ton bombs in a short period of time in a densely populated area, together with the reported use of an artillery barrage, raise questions as to the respect by the IDF of the rules of distinction, precautions, and proportionality. These methods and means employed by the IDF could not, in such a small and densely populated area, be directed at a specific military target and could not adequately distinguish between civilians and civilian objects and military objectives as required by IHL. The information available also indicates that during the Shuja'iyah operation on the 19th and the 20th of July the IDF violated the prohibition of treating several distinct individual military objectives in a densely populated area as one single military objective. Therefore, there are strong indications that the IDF's Shuja'iyah operation on the 19th and the 20th of July was conducted in violation of the prohibition of indiscriminate attacks and may amount to a war crime. The Shuja'iyah operation also raises serious concerns that the IDF did not conform with its obligation to take precautionary measures in attack. The choice of the methods and means used by the IDF cannot be reconciled with the obligation to take constant care to spare civilians and civilian objects or at the very least to minimize incidental loss of civilian life and damage to civilian objects in a densely populated area. The extensive devastation, carried out by the IDF in Qusay, in particular the razing of entire areas of the town by artillery fire, airstrikes and bulldozers, indicates that the IDF carried out destructions that were not required by military necessity. The extent of the destruction combined with the statements made during the operation by the commander of the brigade responsible for the Qusay operation to the effect that Palestinians have to understand that this does not pay off, are indicative of a punitive intent in the action of the IDF in Qusay and may constitute collective punishment. Information received by the Commission suggests that in several cases Palestinians who had been detained, mostly in their homes in Qusay, had been insulted, beaten, threatened to be killed and otherwise ill-treated by IDF soldiers. In some cases the treatment described by some of the witnesses could amount to torture. Other incidents and alleged patterns of behavior in Qusay raise a number of concerns under international law. These incidents include the incidents in which civilians were allegedly shot at by IDF soldiers, attacks against ambulances, and the failure to provide medical assistance to wounded persons. The IDF has argued that the high number of buildings destroyed in Operation Protective Edge resulted from the targeting of terrorist infrastructure and intense fighting on the ground. However, the evidence gathered by the Commission, including the assessment of the episodes above, video and photo materials, observations by UNITAR UNOSAT and anecdotal testimonies by IDF soldiers, indicate that the vast scale of destruction may have been adopted as tactics of war. Alongside the toll on civilian lives, there was enormous destruction of civilian property in Gaza. 18,000 housing units were destroyed in whole or in part. Having a home has an emotional dimension, the place where memories are stored, and often many other items to which inhabitants' memories relate. Having one's home destroyed or severely damaged means being deprived of more than a physical structure. It also directly impacts on the very essence of one's existence. Questions arise regarding the role of senior officials who set military policy in several areas examined by the Commission, such as in the attacks of the Israel Defense Forces on residential buildings, the use of artillery and other explosive weapons with wide area effects in densely populated areas, the destruction of entire neighborhoods in Gaza, and the regular resort to live ammunition by the Israel Defense Forces, notably in crowd control situations, in the West Bank. In many cases, individual soldiers may have been following agreed military policy, but it may be that the policy itself violates the laws of war. Report of the Special Rapporteur on the Situation of Human Rights in the Palestinian Territories Occupied since 1967, the 22nd of October, 2021. The Special Rapporteur remarked that regrettably, the international community's remarkable tolerance for Israeli exceptionalism in its conduct of the occupation has allowed realpolitik to trump rights, power to supplant justice and impunity to undercut accountability. Report of the Special Rapporteur on the Situation of Human Rights in the Palestinian Territories Occupied since 1967, the 22nd of December, 2020. The Special Rapporteur found that the actions of Israel towards the protected population of Gaza amount to collective punishment under international law. The 2 million Palestinians of Gaza are not responsible for the deeds of Hamas and other militant groups, yet they have endured a substantial share of the punishment, intentionally so. Report of the Special Rapporteur on the Situation of Human Rights in the Palestinian Territories Occupied since 1967, the 28th of August, 2023. As regards the treatment by Israel of Palestinian detainees, the Special Rapporteur found instances of torture and cruel, inhumane or degrading treatment include sexual assaults, being hooded and blindfolded, forced to stand for long hours, tied to a chair in painful positions, deprived of sleep and food, or exposed to loud music for long hours, and being punished with solitary confinement. In relation to Palestinian children, in particular, the Special Rapporteur determined that they endure severe ill treatment during interrogation. 31. In 2019, the then prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, ICC, held that there is a reasonable basis to believe that the Israeli army committed war crimes. In the context of the 2014 hostilities in Gaza, in particular. Recently, in October 2023, the prosecutor has confirmed that his office has an ongoing investigation with jurisdiction over Palestine. And this includes jurisdiction over current events in Gaza and also current events in the West Bank. The prosecutor noted that Israel's impeding of relief supplies may constitute a crime within the court's jurisdiction. He further indicated that his office would scrutinize all information in relation to Israeli attacks on dwelling houses, schools, hospitals, churches, and mosques, for compliance with international humanitarian law. The prosecutor has not given any more recent indication as to the state of progress of any investigation in relation to the situation in the State of Palestine, including in response to the request of the 17th of November, 2023 by South Africa and other states that the ICC investigate inter alia the crime of genocide. 2. The West Bank, including East Jerusalem. 32. The West Bank, including East Jerusalem, the larger constituent part of the occupied Palestinian territory, comprises 5,655 square kilometers, with a population of 2.9 million Palestinians, is geographically separated from Gaza, and fragmented by Israeli settlements. 33. The Oslo Accords divided administrative competences over 3 areas of the West Bank, areas A, B, and C not including East Jerusalem, between the Palestinian Authority and Israel, the occupying power. Area A, comprising 18% of the West Bank, is stated to be under the full administrative control of the Palestinian Authority. Area B, comprising 22% of the West Bank, is under the administrative control of the Palestinian Authority and the security control of Israel, and Area C, comprising 60% of the West Bank, is under full Israeli administrative and security control. In 1967, Israel purportedly annexed occupied East Jerusalem to its territory, and in 1980, it incorporated a provision into its basic law claiming Jerusalem United as the capital of Israel, a move censured by the United Nations Security Council as null and void and to be rescinded forthwith. 133 Since 1967, Israel has constructed 279 settlements for Israeli civilians across the West Bank, including 14 settlements in East Jerusalem appropriating 750,000 dunams, 185,329 acres, of Palestinian land. The United Nations Security Council has repeatedly declared that the establishment of such settlements by Israel has no legal validity and constitutes a flagrant violation under international law and a major obstacle to the achievement of the two-state solution and a just, lasting and comprehensive peace. Regardless, the number of Israeli settlers transferred into the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, has increased dramatically from an estimated 247,000 at the time of the Oslo Accords, to over 700,000 in 2023. The prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, ICC, has determined that there is a reasonable basis to believe that members of the Israeli authorities have committed war crimes. In relation, inter alia, to the transfer of Israeli civilians into the West Bank. 34. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the Palestinian territories occupied since 1967, described the situation in the West Bank as follows. There, the Palestinians are subject to a harsh and arbitrary legal system quite unequal to that enjoyed by the Israeli settlers. Much of the West Bank is off-limits to Palestinians, and they regularly endure significant restrictions on their freedom of movement through closures, roadblocks, and the need for hard-to-obtain travel permits. Access to the natural resources of the occupied territory, especially to water, is disproportionately allocated to Israel and the settlers. Similarly, the planning system administered by the occupying power for housing and commercial development throughout the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, is deeply discriminatory in favor of settlement construction, while imposing significant barriers on Palestinians, including ongoing land confiscation, home demolitions, and the denial of building permits. Israel employs practices that in some cases may amount to the forcible transfer of Palestinians, primarily those living in rural areas, as a means of confiscating land for settlements, military weapons training areas and other uses exclusive to the occupying power that have little or nothing to do with its legitimate security requirements. As for East Jerusalem, the occupation has increasingly detached it from its traditional national, economic, cultural and family connections with the West Bank because of the wall, the growing ring of settlements and related checkpoints, and the discriminatory permit regime. It is neglected by the municipality in terms of services and infrastructure. The occupation has depleted its economy and the Palestinians have only a small land area on which to build housing. 35. The institutionalized regime of discriminatory laws, policies, and practices applied by Israel subjects Palestinians to what constitutes an apartheid regime. Palestinians in the West Bank are contained behind a segregating wall, subjected to discriminatory land zoning and planning policies, punitive and administrative house demolitions, violent Israeli army incursions into Palestinian villages, towns, cities, and refugee camps, including in Area A, routine violent Israeli raids on their homes, arbitrary arrests and indefinitely renewable administrative detention, internment without trial, and a dual legal system pursuant to which Palestinians are tried under Israeli military legislation in Israeli military courts, without basic protections of international humanitarian and human rights law, while Israeli settlers living in the same territory are subject to a different legal regime, and tried in Israeli civilian courts with full due process. 36. Palestinians in the West Bank are also subjected to routine violence by Israeli soldiers and armed settlers. Prior to the 7th of October, 2023, between the 1st of January and the 6th of October, 2023, 199 Palestinians had been killed by Israeli soldiers or settlers in the West Bank and 9,000 more had been injured. By September 2023, Save the Children had already declared 2023 the deadliest year for Palestinian children in the West Bank since 2005, with at least 38 Palestinian children having been killed. Since the 7th of October, 2023, a further 295 Palestinians, including 77 children, have been killed by Israeli soldiers and settlers, and a further 3,803, including 576 children, wounded, many seriously. A total of 495 Palestinians have been killed in total in the West Bank, making it the deadliest year for Palestinians since 2005. 37. In a wave of arbitrary mass arrests, Israel has detained more than 3,000 Palestinians from the West Bank and East Jerusalem, including for social media posts relating to the situation in Gaza. Israel significantly increased the number of Palestinians held in administrative detention, without charge or trial, to 2070. Thousands of Palestinians from Gaza working in Israel were also arbitrarily arrested and detained, with 3,200 being forcibly returned to Gaza on 3 November, 2023 into intense full-scale bombardments. Reports that the Palestinian laborers were mistreated on arrest and subjected to physical violence, abuse and humiliation are widespread. Many Palestinian adult and child detainees from the West Bank released in exchange for Israeli hostages report also severe ill treatment, serious beatings, and other outrages to personal dignity since 7 October, 2023 in particular, alongside restrictions on access to food, water, medical treatment, and electricity in Israeli detention. 6 Palestinian detainees from the West Bank have died in Israeli custody since 7 October, 2023, in particular. 19 Israeli prison guards were reportedly questioned for beating to death one of the prisoners, Tcha Abu Asab, in Ketziut prison. 38. Since 7 October, 2023, Israeli forces have carried out airstrikes and military raids on refugee camps in the West Bank, killing many Palestinians, bulldozing roads, and imposing severe restrictions on movement. There have been 236 attacks on healthcare, including hospitals in the West Bank, with Israeli forces detaining health staff and ambulances and preventing ambulances from accessing the wounded. Armed Israeli settler attacks on Palestinians overtly supported by Israeli politicians have also escalated dramatically. Settlers, often accompanied by Israeli soldiers, have killed at least 8 Palestinians and injured at least 85 others, instilling terror among Palestinians, especially farming communities, and damaging property. 2,186 Palestinians in the West Bank, including 1,058 children, have been internally displaced since 7 October, 2023 as a result of extreme Israeli settler violence, alongside punitive or administrative house demolitions carried out by the Israeli army and damage caused to homes during Israeli military raids and operations. The prosecutor of the International Criminal Court indicated in December 2023 that he was accelerating investigations into Israeli settler attacks in the West Bank. 39. Israel's actions in the West Bank since 7 October, 2023, including its support for and failure to prevent or punish Israeli settlers for incitement and violence against Palestinians and Palestinian property, including the driving out of vulnerable Palestinian communities from their lands, are intrinsically connected to Israel's actions in Gaza, and provide at the very least important context to Israel's violations of the Genocide Convention. 3. The attacks in Israel of 7 October, 2023. 40. Israel's military assault in Gaza and its heightened military campaign in the West Bank were launched in response to an attack in Israel on 7 October, 2023, dubbed Operation Al-Aqsa Flood, by 2 Palestinian armed groups, the military wing of Hamas, the Is ad-Din al-Qassam Brigades, and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. The groups launched a large barrage of rockets towards Israel, breached the Israeli fence besieging Gaza, and attacked Israeli military bases and civilian towns, as well as a music festival attended by thousands of young people, in circumstances being investigated by the prosecutor of the ICC. South Africa unequivocally condemns the targeting of Israeli and foreign national civilians by Hamas and other Palestinian armed groups and the taking of hostages on 7 October, 2023, as expressly recorded in its note verbale to Israel of 21 December, 2023. 41. Since 7 October, 2023, over 1,200 Israelis and foreign nationals have been killed in Israel, according to figures provided by the Israeli authorities, including 36 children, the vast majority on the 7th of October, 2023 itself. Approximately 240 civilians including elderly people, women and children and Israeli soldiers were taken as hostages into Gaza. Only 110 of them have been released to date in exchange for 240 Palestinians including elderly people, women and children imprisoned or administratively detained by Israel. 57 hostages are reported to have been killed in Israeli bombardments of Gaza. A further 3 hostages are confirmed to have been shot dead by Israeli soldiers in Gaza. Rockets continue to be fired from Gaza into Israeli territory, leading to the ongoing evacuation of tens of thousands of Israelis, particularly from communities bordering the security fences with Gaza and Lebanon. The ICC prosecutor has warned that hostage-taking represents a grave breach to the Geneva Conventions and the taking and holding of children is an egregious breach of fundamental principles of humanity. United Nations General Assembly Resolutions ES 1021 and ES 1022, 2023, condemn acts of violence aimed at Israeli civilians and call for the release of all civilians who are being illegally held captive. United Nations Security Council Resolution 2712, 2023, also calls for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages held by Hamas and other groups. 42. In response to the attacks of the 7th of October, 2023, Israel vowed to crush and eliminate Hamas, and to clear out the hostile forces that infiltrated our territory and restore the security. On the 7th of October, 2023, the Israeli Prime Minister declared that the IDF will immediately use all its strength to destroy Hamas's capabilities. We will destroy them and we will forcefully avenge this dark day that they have forced on the State of Israel and its citizens. On the 9th of October, 2023, the Prime Minister announced that Israel is at war. Both he and the Israeli president have invoked the right of self-defense as justification for Israel's ongoing military activities in Gaza. The escalation in hostilities between Israel and Hamas, dubbed the Swords of Iron War by Israel, has been referred to in international Western media and commentary as the Israel-Hamas War. C. Genocidal acts committed against the Palestinian people. 43. This section provides an overview of the acts in which Israel has engaged that are genocidal in character, having regard to their nature, scope, and context. These acts are ongoing in a conflict context, where Israel is deliberately imposing telecommunications blackouts on Gaza and restricting access by fact-finding bodies and the international media. At the same time, Palestinian journalists are being killed at a rate significantly higher than has occurred in any conflict in the past 100 years. In the 2 months since the 7th of October, 2023, the number of journalists killed already exceeded that of the entirety of World War II. Further detail will be provided regarding these acts over the course of these proceedings. However, such information as is available establishes that Israel, 1. is engaged in killing Palestinians in Gaza including Palestinian children in large numbers, 2. is causing serious bodily and mental harm to Palestinians in Gaza, including Palestinian children, and is inflicting on them conditions of life intended to bring about their destruction as a group. Those conditions include 3. expulsions from homes and mass displacement, alongside the large-scale destruction of homes and residential areas, 4. deprivation of access to adequate food and water, 4. deprivation of access to adequate medical care, 5. deprivation of access to adequate shelter, clothes, hygiene, and sanitation, and 6. the destruction of the life of the Palestinian people in Gaza, and 7. imposing measures intended to prevent Palestinian births. 44. United Nations chiefs and the International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC, no strangers to conflict situations, have called what is unfolding in Gaza a crisis of humanity. 176 humanitarian veterans who have served in war zones and disasters around the world, people who have seen everything, say they have seen nothing like what they see today in Gaza, United Nations Secretary General. This is a moral failure causing intolerable suffering, ICRC President. 178 This is an apocalyptic situation now, because these are the remnants of a nation being driven into a pocket in the south, Undersecretary General for Humanitarian Affairs and Emergency Relief Coordinator at the United Nations. They describe Palestinians in Gaza as living in utter, deepening horror as they continue to be relentlessly bombarded by Israel. Suffering death, siege, destruction and deprivation of the most essential human needs such as food, water, life-saving medical supplies and other essentials on a massive scale. It is apocalyptic. United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. An entire population is besieged and under attack, denied access to the essentials for survival, bombed in their homes, shelters, hospitals, and places of worship, principles of the United Nations Interagency Standing Committee. Gaza is the most dangerous place in the world to be a child. United Nations International Children's Emergency Fund, UNICEF, Executive Director. It is a living hell, it is a war of all the superlative, everything is unprecedented and we are out of words to describe what is going on. UNRWA Commissioner General. 1. Killing Palestinians in Gaza. 45. Over 21,110 Palestinians are reported to have been killed since Israel began its military assault on Gaza, according to the Palestinian Health Ministry, at least 70% of whom are believed to be women and children. An additional estimated 7,780 people, including at least 4,700 women and children, are reported missing, presumed dead under the rubble of destroyed buildings, dying slow deaths or decomposing in the streets where they were killed. Israel's blockage of adequate fuel imports, its destruction of infrastructure and the communication blackouts it imposes severely hamper rescue attempts. As of the 8th of December, 2023, only one rescue vehicle was reportedly operational in the whole of Gaza, with survivors forced to try to dig for survivors with their bare hands. The level of Israel's killing is so extensive that bodies are being buried in mass graves, often unidentified. 46. Nowhere is safe in Gaza, as the United Nations Secretary-General and many other United Nations experts have now made clear to the international community. Palestinians in Gaza have been killed in their homes, in places where they sought shelter, in hospitals, in UNRWA schools, in churches, in mosques, and as they tried to find food and water for their families. They have been killed if they failed to evacuate, in the places to which they fled, and even while they attempted to flee along Israeli-declared safe routes. Reports are multiplying of Israeli soldiers performing summary executions, including of multiple members of the same family, men, women, and older people. One such account is the reported execution in Gaza City of at least 11 male members of the Annan family and their relatives, boys and men, said to have been separated out by Israeli soldiers and shot in front of their family before the women and children were then attacked. There are also reports of unarmed people, including Israeli hostages, being shot dead on sight, despite posing no threat, including while waving white flags. Attacks on Palestinian homes and residential blocks account for a significant number of the dead, with Israel reportedly using artificial intelligence, AI, to generate up to 100 bombing targets per day. 47. Israel is said to be dropping unguided bombs on Gaza, as well as heavy bombs weighing up to 2,000 pounds, 900 kilograms, 196, which have a predicted lethal radius of up to 360 m, and are expected to cause severe injury and damage as far as 800 meters from the point of impact. This weaponry is being deployed in one of the most densely populated areas in the world, where approximately 1 in every 100 people has now been killed. Some Israeli strikes on Palestinian homes and refugee camps have killed upwards of 110 Palestinians. An estimated 1,779 Palestinian families in Gaza have lost multiple family members, and hundreds of multi-generational families have been killed in their entirety, with no remaining survivors: mothers, fathers, children, siblings, grandparents, aunts, cousins, often all killed together. By the 7th of November, 2023, 312 Palestinian families in Gaza had lost over 10 members each. Numerous Palestinian families have lost upwards of 70 members each. The level of mortality in Palestinian families is such that medics in Gaza have had to coin a new acronym, WCNSF, meaning Wounded Child, No Surviving Family. 48. For Palestinian children, in particular, death is everywhere and nowhere is safe. A total of over 7,729 Palestinian children have been killed in Gaza to date. Over 115 Palestinian children in Gaza are killed every day. It is estimated that more Palestinian children were killed in the first 3 weeks in Gaza alone, a total of 3,195, than the total number of children killed each year across the world's conflict zones since 2019. The scale of Palestinian child killings in Gaza is such that United Nations chiefs have described it as a graveyard for children. Indeed, the unprecedented rate of Palestinian child casualties has prompted UNICEF's spokesperson to call Israel's attacks on Gaza a war on children. He explained, "Most crises, they impact children terribly because children are the most vulnerable, but most have about a casualty rate of children of around 20%. This is 40. This is twice as lethal to children as many conflicts we've seen in the last 15 or 20 years, and unfortunately that is because of the sheer density of population, the indiscriminate nature, and when we see that there's been not even lip service to safe zones having water and sanitation for children and young girls. That same disregard for children is being shown in the bombardments. That's why we see 40% of casualties are children. That's why it's a war on children." 49. Doctors, journalists, teachers, academics, and other professionals are also being killed at wholly unprecedented rates. To date, Israel has killed over 311 doctors, nurses and other health workers, including doctors and ambulance drivers killed on duty, 103 journalists, amounting to over 1 per day, and more than 73% of the total number of journalists and media workers killed globally in 2023. 40 civil defense workers responsible for helping to dig victims out of the rubble killed while on duty, and over 209 teachers and educational staff. 144 United Nations employees have also been killed, the highest number of aid workers killed in UN history in such a short time. It is estimated that it will take years to recover the remains of people from beneath the rubble and that the costly, technical process will not result in the identification of each body. 50. In addition to being killed by Israeli weaponry, Palestinians in Gaza are also at immediate risk of death by starvation, dehydration, and disease as a result of the ongoing siege by Israel, the insufficient aid being allowed through to the Palestinian population, and the extreme difficulties in distributing such limited aid that is permitted to enter the territory due to the decimation of Gaza's infrastructure in Israel's military attacks. 2. Causing serious bodily and mental harm to Palestinians in Gaza. 51. Over 55,243 Palestinians have been wounded in Israel's military attacks on Gaza since the 7th of October, 2023, the majority of them women and children. Burns and amputations are typical injuries, with an estimated 1,000 children having lost one or both legs. There are reports of Israeli forces using white phosphorus in densely populated areas in Gaza. As the World Health Organization describes, even small amounts of white phosphorus can cause deep and severe burns, penetrating even through bone, and capable of reigniting after initial treatment. There are no functioning hospitals in the north of Gaza, in particular, such that injured persons are reduced to waiting to die, unable to seek surgery or medical treatment beyond first aid, dying slow, agonizing deaths from their injuries or from resultant infections. 52. The extreme levels of bombardment and lack of any safe areas are also causing severe mental trauma in the Palestinian population in Gaza. Even before the latest onslaught, Palestinians in Gaza suffered severe trauma from prior attacks. 80% of Palestinian children experienced higher levels of emotional distress, demonstrating bedwetting, 79%, and reactive mutism, 59%, and engaging in self-harm, 59%, and suicidal thoughts, 55%. 11 weeks of relentless bombardment, displacement, and loss will necessarily have led to a further increase in those figures, particularly for the estimated tens of thousands of Palestinian children who have lost at least one parent, and those who are the sole surviving members of their families. For the families who remain intact or partially intact, It's about doing everything you can so your child doesn't realize that you've lost control. 53. It is already known that repeated exposure to conflict and violence, including witnessing and experiencing housing demolition, combined with Israel's siege of Gaza since 2007, is associated with high levels of psychological distress among Palestinians. Indeed, the United Nations Security Council in Resolution 2712, 2023, expressed its deep concern that the disruption of access to education has a dramatic impact on children, and that conflict has lifelong effects on their physical and mental health. That disruption and its dramatic impact on children must be considered, in particular, in the context of the number of Palestinian students and educators who have been killed, 4,037 and 209 respectively, and wounded, estimated at 7,259, and the number of Palestinian schools having been damaged or destroyed, 352. Or 74% of the schools in the whole of Gaza. Medical professionals assess that the health effects on all Palestinian children, women, men, older people, people with disabilities, and people of marginalized identities are immense. An emergency coordinator for Medicine Sans Frontières interviewed on her return from 5 weeks in Gaza described, "It's even worse in reality than it looks. It's the amount of suffering is just something incomparable. It's really unbearable. I'm speechless when I try and think of the future of these children. It's generations of children who will be handicapped, who will be traumatized. The very children in our mental health program are telling us that they would rather die than continue living in Gaza now." 54. Alongside its military campaign, Israel has engaged in the dehumanization and cruel, inhuman and degrading treatment of members Palestinians in Gaza. Large numbers of Palestinian civilians, including children, have reportedly been arrested, blindfolded, forced to undress and remain outside in the cold weather, before being forced onto trucks and taken to unknown locations. Medics and first responders, in particular, have been repeatedly detained by Israeli forces, with many being detained incommunicado at unknown locations. Videos published by Israeli media on Christmas Day appeared to show hundreds of Palestinians, rounded up inside Al Yarmouk football stadium in Gaza City, including children, older people and persons with disabilities, being forced to strip to their underwear in degrading conditions. Many Palestinian detainees who have been released report having been subjected to torture and ill-treatment, including the deprivation of food, water, shelter, and access to toilets. The United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, OCHA, reports video footage showing bruises and burns on the bodies of detainees. Images of mutilated and burned corpses alongside videos of armed attacks by Israeli soldiers billed as exclusive content from the Gaza Strip are reportedly circulated in Israel via a social media Telegram channel called 72 Virgins Uncensored. 3. Mass expulsion from homes and displacement of Palestinians in Gaza. 55. It is estimated that over 1.9 million Palestinians out of Gaza's population of 2.3 million people, approximately 85% of the population, have been forced from their homes. There is nowhere safe for them to flee to. Those who cannot leave or refuse to be displaced have been killed or are at extreme risk of being killed in their homes. 56. Israel is repeatedly issuing evacuation orders demanding that Palestinian civilians in certain areas of Gaza leave their homes for other areas. The first such order, issued on the 13th of October, 2023, demanded that the 1 million Palestinians living or otherwise present in the north of Gaza, including Gaza to the south of Gaza within a 24-hour window. The International Committee of the Red Cross warned that the evacuation directive, impacting approximately 36% of Gaza's territory combined with the complete siege of Gaza, was not compatible with international humanitarian law. The World Health Organization warned that it could be tantamount to a death sentence for hospital patients. The evacuation was, however, maintained and has been reissued on a number of occasions, including on the 28th of October, 2023, ahead of the Israeli announcement of ground operations in northern Gaza, and again thereafter. Israel has also issued more specific evacuation notices, ordering people in certain parts of Gaza City to evacuate to other parts. Many of those who are unwilling or unable to evacuate are then bombed in their homes. 57. Palestinians fleeing the north pursuant to Israel's evacuation orders were urged to move south along Gaza's main traffic artery, Salah al-Din Road, on certain days, during certain designated hours. However, there were numerous reported instances of shelling along the routes and of other violence by Israeli forces against evacuating Palestinian civilians, including inhuman and degrading treatment, arbitrary arrests, unlawful detention, and killings. Israel has also continued bombing south of Wadi Gaza throughout this time, killing many Palestinians who evacuated, initially prompting many Palestinian families to seek to return north to at least risk being bombed in the familiar surrounding of their homes. Some of those attempting to return north during the temporary pause in hostilities between Israel and Hamas were shot at by Israeli forces, who killed at least 2 people, and injured others. 58. On the 1st of December, 2023, the end of the 8-day temporary truce between Israel and Hamas. Israel began dropping leaflets, urging Palestinians to leave areas in the south to which they had previously been told to flee, an area constituting approximately 30% of Gaza. As stated by the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the Human Rights of Internally Displaced Persons, Israel has reneged on promises of safety made to those who complied with its order to evacuate northern Gaza 2 months ago. Now, they have been forcibly displaced again, alongside the population of southern Gaza. Israel also published a detailed map online, dividing the Gaza Strip into hundreds of small areas. The map was ostensibly intended to provide notice of Israeli orders to evacuate individual areas ahead of planned airstrikes. However, as noted by OCHA, the publication does not specify where people should evacuate to. Moreover, after months of bombardment amidst the ongoing electricity blackout imposed by Israel since the 11th of October, 2023 and regular telecommunications blackouts, most Palestinians in Gaza have little access to electricity to charge phones or other devices and no reliable way of accessing the map. The United Nations Secretary-General has remarked that the people of Gaza are being told to move like human pinballs ricocheting between ever smaller slivers of the south, without any of the basics for survival. 60. For many Palestinians, the forced evacuation from their homes is necessarily permanent. Israel has now damaged or destroyed an estimated 355,000 Palestinian homes, amounting to 60% of the entire housing stock in Gaza. The extent of the destruction in the north of Gaza, in particular, has rendered it largely unlivable, with the destruction in the south reaching a similar level. As noted by the Special Rapporteur on the Human Rights of Internally Displaced Persons, Gaza's housing and civilian infrastructure have been razed to the ground, frustrating any realistic prospects for displaced Gazans to return home, repeating a long history of mass forced displacement of Palestinians by Israel. The forced displacements in Gaza are genocidal, in that they are taking place in circumstances calculated to bring about the physical destruction of Palestinians in Gaza. 4. Deprivation of access to adequate food and water to Palestinians in Gaza. 61. On the 9th of October, 2023, Israel declared a complete siege on Gaza, allowing no electricity, no food, no water, and no fuel to enter the Strip. Although the siege has been partially alleviated since then, with some aid trucks being permitted in since the 21st of October, 2023, this remains wholly insufficient, and well below the pre-October 2023 average of approximately 500 trucks per day. Moreover, fuel imports permitted since the 21st of November, 2023 are well below the minimum requirements for essential humanitarian operations, meaning that such limited humanitarian aid as is being allowed in cannot easily be moved around Gaza away from entry points. As the Secretary-General has starkly assessed, the level of destruction in Gaza is now so catastrophic that the conditions for the effective delivery of humanitarian aid no longer exist. But even if sufficient supplies were permitted into Gaza, intense bombardment and hostilities, Israeli restrictions on movement, fuel shortages, and interrupted communications make it impossible for UN agencies and their partners to reach most of the people in need. 62. In light of that, the United Nations Security Council Resolution 2720 of the 22nd of December, 2023 is widely slated to be ineffectual, despite demanding that the parties to the conflict allow and facilitate the use of all available routes to and throughout the entire Gaza Strip, including border crossings, and requesting that the coordinator expeditiously establish a United Nations mechanism for accelerating the provision of humanitarian relief consignments. That is because the watered-down resolution fails properly to address the four elements identified by the United Nations Secretary-General as necessary for allowing effective aid, capable of assisting Palestinians in Gaza. 1. Security. We are providing aid in a war zone. The intense Israeli bombardment and active combat in densely populated urban areas throughout Gaza threaten the lives of civilians and humanitarian aid workers alike. 2. Staff. The humanitarian operation requires staff who can live and work in safety. 136 of our colleagues in Gaza have been killed in 75 days, something we have never seen in the history of the United Nations. In these appalling conditions, they can only meet a fraction of the needs. 3. Logistics. Many of our vehicles and trucks were destroyed or left behind following our forced, hurried evacuation from the north, but the Israeli authorities have not allowed any additional trucks to operate in Gaza. This is massively hampering the aid operation. Delivering in the north is extremely dangerous due to active conflict, unexploded ordnance, and heavily damaged roads. Everywhere, frequent communications blackouts make it virtually impossible to coordinate the distribution of aid, and to let people know how to access it. 4. And the resumption of commercial activities. Shelves are empty. Wallets are empty, stomachs are empty. Just one bakery is operating in the whole of Gaza. I urge the Israeli authorities to lift restrictions on commercial activity immediately. We are ready to scale up our cash grant support to vulnerable families, the most effective form of humanitarian aid. But in Gaza, there is very little to buy. Having regard to those factors, the Secretary-General was clear to advise that focusing on the number of trucks permitted into Gaza daily was misleading. Many people are measuring the effectiveness of the humanitarian operation in Gaza based on the number of trucks from the Egyptian Red Crescent, the UN, and our partners that are allowed to unload aid across the border. This is a mistake. The real problem is that the way Israel is conducting this offensive is creating massive obstacles to the distribution of humanitarian aid inside Gaza. 63. It is for that reason that United Nations Security Council Resolution 2720, which fails properly to address the situation on the ground, including by failing to call for a ceasefire, has been described by a former senior UNRWA official as a green light for continued genocide, marked by the wholesale and industrial ignoring of international humanitarian law. Oxfam has called the failure to call for a ceasefire in the resolution incomprehensible and utterly callous, as well as a profound dereliction of duty on the part of the United Nations Security Council, having regard to the extreme seriousness of the situation in Gaza. 64. Israel has now pushed the Palestinian population in Gaza to the brink of famine, with international agencies warning that the risk of famine is real, World Food Programme or WFP, and that it is increasing each day. IPC. Most of the Palestinian people in Gaza are now starving, with levels of starvation rising daily. The World Health Organization warns that hunger is ravaging Gaza. As the United Nations Secretary-General has stated, 4 out of 5 of the hungriest people anywhere in the world are in Gaza, with Palestinians in Gaza facing the highest levels of acute food insecurity ever classified by the IPC. UNRWA's Commissioner General describes desperate, hungry, and terrified people, who are now stopping aid trucks, taking the food, and eating it right away. The World Health Organization has stated that an unprecedented 93% of the population in Gaza is facing crisis levels of hunger, with insufficient food and high levels of malnutrition. They say that at least 1 in 4 households are facing catastrophic conditions, experiencing an extreme lack of 64. Israel has now pushed the Palestinian population in Gaza to the brink of famine, with international agencies warning that the risk of famine is real, World Food Programme or WFP, and that it is increasing each day, IPC. Most of the Palestinian people in Gaza are now starving, with levels of starvation rising daily. The World Health Organization warns that hunger is ravaging Gaza. As the United Nations Secretary-General has stated, 4 out of 5 of the hungriest people anywhere in the world are in Gaza, with Palestinians in Gaza facing the highest levels of acute food insecurity ever classified by the IPC. UNRWA's Commissioner General describes desperate, hungry, and terrified people, who are now stopping aid trucks, taking the food, and eating it right away. The World Health Organization has stated that an unprecedented 93% of the population in Gaza is facing crisis levels of hunger, with insufficient food and high levels of malnutrition. They say that at least 1 in 4 households are facing catastrophic conditions, experiencing an extreme lack of food and starvation, and having resorted to selling off their possessions and other extreme measures to afford a simple meal. They caution that starvation, destitution, and death are evident, calling Israel's actions in cutting off Gaza from water, food, anything which is necessary for any sort of life a cruel campaign, brought against the whole population of Gaza. Their emergency medical team's coordinator explained that every single person he speaks to is hungry. Everywhere we go, people are asking us for food. Even in the hospital, I walked around in the emergency department, somebody with an open bleeding wound, an open fracture, they asked for food. If that's not an indicator of the desperation, I don't know what is. The situation is such that the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights has felt the need to caution that starvation must never be a means or result of warfare. Oxfam and Human Rights Watch have gone even further in expressly accusing Israel of using starvation as a weapon of war against the Palestinian people in Gaza. 65. The conditions created by the siege are exacerbated by Israel's continuing strikes on Gaza, including on its bakeries, water facilities, and last remaining operating mill, and its razing of agricultural lands, crops, orchards, and greenhouses. By the 16th of November, 2023, the food infrastructure in Gaza was already considered no longer functional, given shop and market closures, the lack of essential food items, and the inflated price of the scarce food available. Bread is scarce or non-existent, with food scarcity leading to significant price hikes, and the price of flour increasing by 65% at one stage. Livestock that has not been killed is facing starvation, and crops are damaged or destroyed. Many Palestinians are resorting to foraging due to hunger, collecting spilled flour from aid distributions from the road, or other unsafe food practices. 66. Water is also severely depleted. Israel continues to cut off piped water for the north of Gaza, 288, and the north's water desalination plant is non-functioning. From the 15th of October, 2023, Israel began piping a small amount of water to the south, in part to push the civilian population to the southern part of the Strip. The damage from Israeli airstrikes and shelling has also rendered most of the water system inoperable. The World Food Programme has reported that there is only 1.5 to 1.8 liters of clean water available per person per day, for all uses, drinking, washing, food preparation, sanitation, and hygiene. This is far below the emergency threshold of 15 liters per day for war or famine-like conditions, or the survival threshold of 3 liters per day. The World Health Organization Emergency Medical Team's coordinator described the scene at Al-Ali Arab Hospital, where medical staff were struggling to cope with no food, no fuel, no water, stating that it looks more like a hospice now than a hospital. But a hospice implies a level of care that the doctors and nurses are unable to provide. It's pretty unbearable to see somebody with casts on multiple limbs, external fixator on multiple limbs, without drinking water and almost no fluids available. He said that patients were crying out in pain, but they were also crying out for us to give them water. He urged that the time is now. We are dealing with starving people now, adults, children, it's unbearable. 67. The lack of water is severely impacting lactating women, in particular, who, even if undertaking only a moderate amount of exercise, require a supply of 7.5 liters of water a day for drinking, sanitation, and hygiene to keep themselves and their babies healthy. Young mothers unable to breastfeed for lack of proper nutrition arising from the food scarcity have been forced to use contaminated water to prepare formula where it is available, risking disease in vulnerable babies. In parallel, the chronic unavailability of formula is also risking the lives of newborn babies, who are already reportedly dying from avoidable causes due to the absence of medical care, food, water, and adequate sanitation. 296. The impacts of malnourishment on older children may also be particularly grave and long-lasting, preventing them from reaching their full potential in terms of physical growth, cognitive capacity, school performance, and productivity later in life. Many health workers also lack sufficient food and water to continue working, which will also necessarily further impact on health and mortality rates. 68. This is all happening to a population that was already extremely vulnerable as a result of Israel's prior actions against Gaza. Israel has long hindered the creation and repair of water installation and desalination plants in Gaza, such that 95% of water from Gaza's sole aquifer was already unsuitable for consumption prior to the 7th of October, 2023. Through its 16-year blockade, Israel also severely impacted water supply. Its repeated attacks on Gaza and its restrictions on repairing the degraded wastewater infrastructure damaged the soil, rendering agriculture challenging. Israel also restricted access by Palestinians in Gaza to up to 35% of agricultural land and up to 85% of Gaza's fishing waters. Consequently, over 68% of households, around 1.3 million people, were severely or moderately food insecure prior to the 7th of October, 2023, with 58% of the population dependent on humanitarian aid. 7,685 children under 5 years of age in Gaza were suffering from life-threatening wasting, the deadliest form of child malnutrition. The impact on Palestinian children of Israel's forced starvation of Gaza will necessarily be serious and long-lasting. 69. Recent reports of Israeli plans to flood tunnels in Gaza with seawater is of extreme concern, given the risks it would pose of further degradation and collapse of Gaza's water and sewage infrastructure, and of long-lasting contamination of Gaza's aquifer and soil. Environmental experts have warned that the strategy risks causing an ecological catastrophe that would leave Gaza with no drinkable water, devastate what little agriculture is possible, and ruin the conditions of life of everyone in Gaza. The United Nations Special Rapporteur for the Right to Water is reported to have compared the plan to the mythical Roman salting of the fields of Carthage to prevent crop growth and render the territory uninhabitable. 70. Experts are now predicting that more Palestinians in Gaza may die from starvation and disease than airstrikes, and yet Israel is intensifying its bombing campaign, precluding the effective delivery of humanitarian assistance to Palestinians. It is clear that Israel is, through its actions and policies in Gaza, deliberately inflicting on Palestinians conditions of life calculated to bring about their destruction. 5. Deprivation of access to adequate shelter, clothes, hygiene, and sanitation to Palestinians in Gaza. 71. The majority of the 1.9 million displaced Palestinians in Gaza are seeking shelter in UNRWA facilities, which primarily consist of schools and tents. These locations are themselves not safe, to date, and despite Israel having been provided with the coordinates of all United Nations facilities, Israel has killed hundreds of Palestinian men, women, and children seeking shelter in UNRWA facilities, and injured over 1,000. 72. The situation in UNRWA shelters was described as follows by the Commissioner General of UNRWA in his 7 December, 2023 letter, of which the United Nations General Assembly took note in its resolution ES 1022 of 12 December, 2023. Today, as a result of Israel's military operation, nearly 1.2 million civilians are sheltering in UNRWA premises. The agency has become the primary platform for humanitarian assistance to over 2 million people in Gaza, a platform on the verge of collapse. UNRWA is, as of today, still operational in Gaza, though just barely. Our staff are still operating health centers, managing shelters, and supporting traumatized people, some arriving carrying their dead children. We are still distributing food, even though the corridors and courtyards of our premises are too crowded to walk through. Our staff take their children to work so they know they are safe or can die together. More than 130 UNRWA staff are confirmed killed in bombardments, most with their families. The number might rise by the time you read this. At least 70% of UNRWA staff are displaced, and lack food, water, and adequate shelter. We are hanging on by our fingertips. If UNRWA collapses, humanitarian assistance in Gaza will also collapse. The humanitarian situation is now untenable. Conditions in Gaza were already appalling when I stayed overnight 2 weeks ago. I witnessed constant explosive munitions from sky, land, and sea, and the massive destruction of civilian infrastructure. This week, the Israeli military forces have instructed people to move further south, forcing Gaza's population into an ever-shrinking space. Shelters are shockingly overcrowded, with high risk of epidemic illness. In these overfull and unsanitary spaces, more than 700 people use a single toilet, women give birth, an average of 25 per day, and people nurse open wounds. Tens of thousands sleep in courtyards and streets. People burn plastic to stay warm. Nearly 90 UNRWA premises, including schools, have been hit or impacted by munitions, killing over 270 internally displaced people, many this week. In Gaza as a whole, over 16,000 people, 2/3 of whom are women and children, are reported killed during bombardments. Large swathes of Gaza are destroyed and uninhabitable. The premise of UNRWA's mandate to provide services to Palestine refugees until there is a political solution is at great risk. Without safe shelter and aid, civilians in Gaza risk death or will be forced to Egypt and beyond. Forced displacement out of Gaza may end prospects for the political solution that is intrinsic to UNRWA's mandate, with grave risks for regional peace and security. A forced displacement beyond Palestinian land, reminiscent of the 1948 Nakba, must be prevented. In my 35 years working in complex emergencies, I have never written such a letter predicting the killing of my staff and the collapse of the mandate I am expected to fulfill. 73. Those Palestinians with a place in UNRWA shelters are the lucky ones, according to UNRWA's Commissioner General. Others attempt to find shelter in the homes of relatives or strangers, in government facilities, hospital courtyards, or makeshift camps, without any access to food, water, or sanitary facilities, or simply live and sleep in the streets, exposed to the elements. UNRWA's shelters now have on average 486 people using a single toilet, while other locations where people are seeking to shelter often have no toilets at all. Palestinians are unable to maintain personal hygiene, with menstruating girls and women being particularly impacted. The World Health Organization estimates that there is on average only one shower for every 4,500 people. Newborns in shelters are reportedly dying from avoidable causes due to the absence of adequate sanitation, food, water, and medical care. 74. Since the Commissioner General of UNRWA wrote to the President of the United Nations General Assembly on the 7th of December, 2023, advising that the humanitarian situation in Gaza was already untenable, over 1 million Palestinians have continued to be forced by Israeli military orders into the Rafah governorate near the Egyptian border. The area has become the epicenter of displacement, with an estimated fourfold increase in its population density, thought to now exceed 12,000 people per square kilometer. OCHA is warning there is no empty space left for people to shelter, not even in the streets and other open areas. Al-Mawasi, a sandy, barren strip of approximately 14 square kilometers along the Mediterranean Sea, without aid provisions, water, food, or sanitation, the so-called safe zone to which Israel has told Palestinians in Gaza to flee, is anything but safe. As UNRWA has underscored, unilaterally declared safe zones are not safe at all. Nowhere in Gaza is safe. The head of humanitarian policy at Save the Children International has warned, people are in overcrowded shelters in makeshift tents. There is no access to clean water, there are crumbling sanitation facilities. We've heard of children starving in the so-called safe zone of Al-Mawasi. 75. Throughout Gaza, there are acute shortages in warm clothes, bedding, blankets, and critical non-food items, with people heavily dependent on salvaged wood and waste for cooking and warmth, raising the risk of respiratory diseases. There is also an acute shortage of clean water, severely impacting not just the ability to hydrate, but to wash, clean and cook. The siege and infrastructure damage from bombing continue to prevent adequate water treatment and distribution, and sewage management, with flooding exponentially increasing the risks of the spread of infectious diseases amongst displaced Palestinians. On the 20th of December, 2023, the Director General of the World Health Organization warned that Gaza is already experiencing soaring rates of infectious disease outbreaks. Diarrhea cases among children aged under 5 are 25 times what they were before the conflict. Such illnesses can be lethal for malnourished children, more so in the absence of functioning health services. Sewage is flowing into the streets where Palestinians are living, as it can no longer be managed. Everywhere you look is congested with makeshift shelters. Everywhere you go, people are desperate, hungry, and terrified. 330 These conditions deliberately inflicted by Israel are calculated to bring about the destruction of the Palestinian group in Gaza. 6. Deprivation of adequate medical assistance to Palestinians in Gaza. 76. Almost above all else, Israel's military assault on Gaza has been an attack on Gaza's medical healthcare system, indispensable to the life and survival of the Palestinians in Gaza. Israel has declared an unrelenting war on the health system in Gaza, as observed by the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the right of everyone to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. In a statement issued on the 7th of December, 2023, the United Nations expert noted that the healthcare infrastructure in the Gaza Strip has been completely obliterated and that we bear witness to a shameful war on healthcare workers. She warned that we are in the darkest time for the right to health in our lifetimes and that we have descended into depths from which we must quickly emerge. 77. In a letter to the United Nations Security Council on the 4th of December, 2023, the International President of Médecins Sans Frontières wrote, Israel has shown a blatant and total disregard for the protection of Gaza's medical facilities. We are watching as hospitals are turned into morgues and ruins. These supposedly protected facilities are being bombed, are being shot at by tanks and guns, encircled and raided, killing patients and medical staff. The World Health Organization has documented 203 attacks on healthcare that have led to at least 22 fatalities and 59 injuries of health workers on duty. Medical staff, including our own, are utterly exhausted and in despair. They have had to amputate limbs from children suffering from severe burns without anesthesia or sterilized surgical tools. Due to forcible evacuations by Israeli soldiers, some doctors have had to leave patients behind after facing the unimaginable choice between their lives or those of their patients. There is no justification for the atrocious attacks on healthcare. 4 of our MSF staff have been killed, many more have lost family members. Numerous other colleagues have been injured. Other humanitarian organizations have reported dozens of their staff have been killed. Northern Gaza is being erased from the map. The health system has collapsed. Our emergency team in Khan Yunis, in southern Gaza, has reported massive influxes of wounded after intense bombing. Last Saturday, 60 dead and 213 injured people arrived at the emergency room of Al-Aqsa Hospital. These strikes are also hitting overcrowded, squalid refugee camps, where people are barely surviving on the sparse humanitarian aid available. If the bombs do not get them, infectious diseases and starvation will. We did what we could. Remember us. These other words are Dr. Mahmoud Abu Nujayla, who has since been killed in a hospital strike, wrote on a Gaza hospital whiteboard normally used for planning surgeries. When the guns fall silent and the true scale of devastation is revealed, will the Council and its members be able to say the same? 78. Since early December 2023, Israeli army attacks on Palestinian hospitals have only increased. The Israeli army has continued to attack and besiege hospitals and healthcare centers, to deprive them of electricity and fuel crucial to maintain effective functioning and equipment, to obstruct them from receiving medical supplies, food and water, to force their evacuations and closure, and effectively to destroy them. The north of Gaza, without any functioning hospital for a week, has only 4 severely challenged partially functioning hospitals available now. Israel has transformed Palestinian hospitals in Gaza from places of healing into death zones, and scenes of bloodbath, death, devastation, and despair. Many hospitals have now become mere places where people are waiting to die. The World Health Organization describes the situation as unconscionable and beyond belief. 79. There have now been more than 238 attacks on healthcare in Gaza, in which over 61 hospitals and other healthcare facilities have been damaged or destroyed. Only 13 out of 36 hospitals and 18 out of 72 healthcare centers are still even functioning, some of them barely, despite the overwhelming number of people injured in Israeli attacks. The Israeli army has targeted hospital generators, hospital solar panels, and other life-saving equipment, such as oxygen stations and water tanks. It has also targeted ambulances, medical convoys and first responders. 311 health workers have been killed, on average 4 killed per day, including at least 22 health workers killed on duty. Those killed include some of Gaza's most experienced and skilled doctors, including Dr. Hani al-Haytham, head of the emergency section at Al-Shifa Hospital, killed with his wife, Dr. Samir Girafi, and their children, Dr. Mohammed Dabba, head of pathology at Al-Shifa Hospital, reportedly killed with his son and father while attempting to flee Gaza City, Dr. Medot Saidam, plastic reconstructive Ben surgeon at Al-Shifa Hospital, and Dr. Hammam Alo, nephrologist at Al-Shifa Hospital, were killed in attacks on their family homes. Interviewed shortly before his death, Dr. Alo responded as follows when asked why he was not fleeing the north to the south: "If I go, who would treat my patients? We are not animals, we have the right to receive proper health care. You think I went to medical school and for my postgraduate degrees for a total of 14 years, so I think only about my life and not my patients." The systematic destruction of Palestinian hospitals and the killing of specialist Palestinian doctors is not only impacting the care of Palestinians in Gaza at present, it is also undermining the prospect of a future Palestinian healthcare system in Gaza, destroying its capacity to rebuild and to care effectively for the Palestinian people in Gaza. 80. At least 570 Palestinians have been killed at hospitals and healthcare centers in Gaza, and a further 746 have been injured. They include patients and internally displaced Palestinians, who vainly sought sanctuary on or near hospital grounds, killed by Israeli strikes or snipers. Palestinian mothers have been killed in maternity hospitals, and Palestinian children in children's hospitals. Even those tending to and counting the dead, like Saeed al-Shorbaji, director of Nasser Hospital's mortuary, have themselves been killed. Some have been victims of Israeli attacks multiple times over, like 12-year-old Dina Abu Mohsen, interviewed by UNICEF after losing her parents, 2 siblings, and her leg in an Israeli strike on her home. She was then killed herself when the Israeli army shelled the hospital where she was being treated. 81. Other Palestinians have died as a direct result of Israel cutting off electricity and fuel to hospitals. They include 5 premature babies and 40 ICU and kidney patients at Al-Shifa Hospital. 355 other Palestinians have died as a direct result of Israel's forced evacuation of hospitals, including at least 4 babies in Al-Nasser Hospital, whose tiny bodies were found weeks later during a temporary ceasefire, decomposing in their hospital beds. Hospital courtyards have been turned into sites of mass graves. At Al-Shifa Hospital, it was medics themselves who had to dig a mass grave for the decomposing bodies of 179 patients and others. Israeli bulldozers excavated and exhumed a hospital mass grave in the besieged Kamal Adwan Hospital on the 16th of December, where 26 Palestinians had been buried. Speaking to CNN, Hossam Abu Safiya, head of pediatric services at Kamal Adwan Hospital, stated, "The soldiers dug up the graves this morning and dragged the bodies with bulldozers, then crushed the bodies with the bulldozers. I have never seen such a thing before." 82. United Nations General Assembly Resolution ES 1021 of 27 October, 2023 calling for the respect and protection of all civilian and humanitarian facilities, including hospitals and other medical facilities, as well as all of humanitarian and medical personnel, has been resolutely ignored. Doctors and medics have continued not only to be killed but also to be rounded up and disappeared by the Israeli authorities. They include the General Director of Al-Shifa and his staff, seized and held incommunicado since 23 November 2023.36383. Those wounded by Israel in Gaza are being deprived of life-saving medical care. Gaza's healthcare system, already crippled by years of blockade and prior attacks by Israel, is unable to cope with the sheer scale of the injuries, now at 55,243 injured, including at least 8,663 children. 365. There are reports of severely injured patients walking for miles trying to find help. UNICEF highlighted the case of a boy from the north whose leg had been blown off in the violence, who had spent 3 or 4 days trying to reach the south, delayed by checkpoints. The smell of decomposition was clear. And that boy had shrapnel all over. Potentially, he was blind and had burns to 50% of his body. OCHA identified the case of a woman with shrapnel injuries in her abdomen, who had walked from the north to the south pressing a towel against her wounds. Palestinians have had to evacuate their sick, disabled and wounded in a forced march from the north to the south, and then again from the south onwards, dragging hospital beds behind cars, pushing wheelchairs, raising them on makeshift stretchers, or simply carrying them in their arms. 84. Those hospitals which are still functioning are described as scenes from a horror movie. 369. The critical shortages of staff and supplies, including anesthetics, analgesics, medicine and disinfectants, have led not only to otherwise unnecessary amputations of limbs, but also to amputations without anesthesia, often undertaken by flashlight. Pregnant women are also being subjected to cesareans without anesthetic. Patients are being treated on dirty floors covered with blood, with family members having to stand holding saline bags, where saline is even available. There are insufficient staff and resources for adequate wound or post-operative wound care. Unclean wounds, often infested with worms and flies, rapidly become infected, necrotic or gangrenous. 376. Patients plead for food and water. Even basic pain management treatment is often unavailable, and patients are at risk of dying from treatable conditions. One doctor described having to do procedures without anesthetic. He said, "I was forced to do dressing changes on massive wounds, excruciatingly painful wounds. There was a girl with just her whole body covered in shrapnel. She was 9. I ended up having to change and clean these wounds with no anesthetic and no analgesic. I managed to find some intravenous paracetamol to give her. Her dad was crying, I was crying, and the poor child was screaming." 85. In addition to the war wounded, there are hundreds of thousands of Palestinians in Gaza who still need routine medical care for conditions such as high blood pressure, cardiovascular disease, or diabetes. Thousands of Palestinians in Gaza are also in need of urgent care for kidney disease and cancer, and an estimated 130 premature babies are dependent on incubators for survival at any given time. Many of them are now unable to receive medical assistance. UNICEF warns that women, children, and newborns in Gaza are disproportionately bearing the burden of the escalation of hostilities in the occupied Palestinian territory, both as casualties and in reduced access to health services. Older persons and persons with disabilities lack essential medication, and are at higher risk of communicable diseases, malnutrition, and death. Pregnant women are also particularly vulnerable. 86. Experts are beginning to warn that the numbers of Palestinians dying as a result of disease and hunger could already be outstripping violent deaths caused by Israeli army assaults. There have already been over 360,000 documented cases of communicable diseases reported in UNRWA shelters alone, brought on or exacerbated by unsanitary conditions, hunger, and lack of clean water, with the actual numbers believed to be considerably higher. As stated by the World Health Organization, Gaza is already experiencing soaring rates of infectious diseases. Over 100,000 cases of diarrhea have been reported since mid-October. Half of these are among young children under the age of 5 years, case numbers that are 25 times what was reported before the conflict. Over 150,000 cases of upper respiratory infection, and numerous cases of meningitis, skin rashes, scabies, lice, and chickenpox have been reported. Hepatitis is also suspected, as many people present with the telltale signs of jaundice. While a healthy body can more easily fight off these diseases, a wasted and weakened body will struggle. Hunger weakens the body's defenses and opens the door to disease. Malnutrition increases the risk of children dying from illnesses like diarrhea, pneumonia, and measles, especially in a setting where they lack access to life-saving health services. Even if the child survives, wasting can have lifelong impacts as it stunts growth and impairs cognitive development. The people of Gaza, who have already suffered enough, now face death from starvation and diseases that could be easily treated with a functioning health system. This must stop. Food and other aid must flow in far greater amounts. WHO reiterates its call for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. 87. Experts assess that the death toll from disease and hunger could be multiples of that from fighting and airstrikes. Israel is, through its relentless attacks on the Palestinian healthcare system in Gaza, is deliberately inflicting on Palestinians in Gaza conditions of life calculated to bring about their destruction. Writing in the British medical journal, The Lancet, a group of medics highlight the health dimensions of violence resulting from the ongoing siege and attacks against Palestinians, rightly warning of a grave risk of genocide against the Palestinian people. 7. Destruction of Palestinian life in Gaza. 88. On the 16th of November, 2023, 15 United Nations Special Rapporteurs and 21 members of United Nations working groups, warning of a genocide in the making in Gaza, observed that the level of destruction that had by then taken place of housing units, as well as hospitals, schools, mosques, bakeries, water pipes, sewage and electricity networks, threatens to make the continuation of Palestinian life in Gaza impossible. As they note, Israel has in its bombing campaign against Gaza used powerful weaponry with inherently indiscriminate impacts, resulting in a colossal death toll and destruction of life-sustaining infrastructure. Israel has destroyed not only individual homes, houses, and whole apartment blocks, it has destroyed entire streets, and entire neighborhoods. Shujaia, a suburb of Gaza City, once home to approximately 110,000 Palestinians, appears to now be a vast wasteland, entirely flattened as far as the eye can see. Its shops, schools, vibrant marketplace, family homes, doctors' clinics, historic streets and Ibn Uthman Mosque, and everything that once sustained Palestinian life there has been damaged or destroyed, along with so many of its people. Other areas in Gaza appear to have experienced a similar level of destruction, including Beit Hanoun, Beit Lahia, Gaza Old City, Ol Rimel, and Nuseirat refugee camp in the south. 89. Across Gaza, Israel has targeted the infrastructure and foundations of Palestinian life, deliberately creating conditions of life calculated to bring about the physical destruction of Palestinian people. In addition to the attacks previously cited on homes, neighborhoods, hospitals, water systems, agricultural lands, bakeries, and mills, Israel has also targeted the foundational civil system in Gaza. Israel has targeted the Palace of Justice, the main Palestinian court building in Gaza housing the Palestinian Supreme Court, the Constitutional Court, the Court of Appeal, the Court of First Instance, the Administrative Court and the Magistrates' Court, as well as an archive of court records and other historical files. Israel has also significantly damaged the Palestinian Legislative Council complex. It has targeted Gaza City's Central Archive building, containing thousands of historical documents and national records dating back over 100 years, and forming an essential archive of Palestinian history, as well as more modern records for Gaza City's urban development. 90. Israel has left Gaza City's main public library in ruins. It has also damaged or destroyed countless bookshops, publishing houses, libraries, and hundreds of educational facilities. Israel has targeted every one of Gaza's 4 universities, including the Islamic University of Gaza, the oldest higher education institution in the territory, which has trained generations of doctors and engineers, amongst others, destroying campuses for the education of future generations of Palestinians in Gaza. Alongside so many others, Israel has killed leading Palestinian academics, including Professor Sufyan Ta'i, the president of the Islamic University and award-winning physicist and UNESCO chair of astronomy, astrophysics, and space sciences in Palestine, who died, alongside his family, in an airstrike. Dr. Ahmed Hamdi Abu Absa, dean of the software engineering department at the University of Palestine, reportedly shot dead by Israeli soldiers as he walked away, having been released from 3 days of enforced disappearance, and Professor Mohammed Shabir, professor of immunology and virology, and former president of the Islamic University of Gaza, and Professor Rafat Al-Arir, poet and professor of comparative literature and creative writing at the Islamic University of Gaza, were both killed by Israel with members of their families. Professor Al-Arir was a co-founder of We Are Not Numbers, a Palestinian youth project seeking to tell the stories behind otherwise impersonal accounts of Palestinians and Palestinian deaths in the news. 91. Israel has damaged and destroyed numerous centers of Palestinian learning and culture, including the Old Safar Damari Mosque and Center for Manuscripts and Ancient Documents, the Orthodox Cultural Center, the Al-Qarara Cultural Museum, the Gaza Center for Culture and Arts, the Arab Social Cultural Center, the Harkawi Society for Culture and Arts, and the Rafah Museum, Gaza's newly opened Museum of Palestinian Heritage, housing hundreds of cultural and archaeological artifacts. Israel's attacks have destroyed Gaza's ancient history. 8 sites have been damaged or destroyed, including the ancient port of Gaza, known as Anthedon Harbor or Old Balakia, the archaeological site of a 2,000-year-old Roman cemetery listed on both the Islamic Heritage List and the tentative UNESCO World Heritage List. Israel has also destroyed Gaza City's old city, including its 146-year-old historic houses, mosques, churches, markets, and schools. It has also destroyed Gaza's more recent history of more hopeful times, including the Rashad al-Shur Cultural Center, site of a historic meeting between United States President Bill Clinton and Palestinian President Yasser Arafat 25 years ago, and an important cultural hub for Palestinians in Gaza, with its theater, library, and event space. And Israel is destroying Gaza's future academic and cultural potential, alongside the 352 Palestinian schools it has damaged or destroyed, the 4,037 students and 209 teachers and educational staff it has killed, alongside the other 7,259 students and 619 teachers it has injured. 92. Israel has damaged or destroyed an estimated 318 Muslim and Christian religious sites, demolishing the places where Palestinians have worshipped for generations. These include the Great Omari Mosque, originally a 5th century Byzantine church, an iconic landmark of Gaza's history, architecture, and cultural heritage, and a place of worship by Christians and Muslims for over 1,000 years. Israeli shelling has also damaged the Church of St. Porphyrius, founded in 425 AD and believed to be the 3rd oldest church in the world, alongside 2 other churches that have sustained direct Israeli fire. Gaza's Christians themselves have been targeted and killed by Israel in the very church compounds where they sought shelter. 93. Along with its destruction of the physical monuments to the history and heritage of the Palestinians in Gaza, Israel has sought to destroy the very Palestinian people who form and create that heritage. Gaza's celebrated journalists, its teachers, intellectuals, and public figures, its doctors and nurses, its filmmakers, writers and singers, the directors and deans of its universities, the heads of its hospitals, its eminent scientists, linguists, playwrights, novelists, artists, and musicians. Israel has killed and is killing Palestinian storytellers and poets, Palestinian farmers and fishermen, alongside Gaza's local legends. Pastry chef Masoud Mohammed al-Khatati, killed in an Israeli airstrike on his house on 3 November, 2023, whose shop's motto "Let the poor eat" and reputation for giving away the popular Palestinian treat naif to indigent customers earned him the nickname Father of the Poor. 84-year-old Elham Farah, from one of Palestine's oldest Christian families, a reputed accordionist and music teacher, known as Mother Orange to generations of Palestinian music students for her shock of red hair, shot dead by an Israeli sniper outside the Holy Family Church in Gaza City when she returned home for warm clothes, and was left to bleed to death. And Al-Shama Saidam, the student with the highest final high school exam grades in the whole of Palestine, killed with multiple members of her family in a strike on Al-Nuseirat refugee camp. Just as Israel is destroying the official memory and records of Palestinians in Gaza through its destruction of Gaza's archives and landmarks, it is obliterating Palestinian personal lives and private memories, histories, and futures, through bombing and bulldozing graveyards, destroying family records and photographs, wiping out entire multi-generational families, and killing, maiming and traumatizing a generation of children. As a Palestinian man, in a video by UNRWA, succinctly sums up, "These are all our memories, our entire lives. Now it's all gone, everything has turned into ashes." 94. The Israeli army erecting the Israeli flag over the wreckage of devastated Palestinian homes, towns, and cities, including in Gaza City's Palestine Square itself, and spurred on by calls from within the Israeli government and without to flatten Gaza and re-establish Israeli settlements on the rubble of Palestinian homes, is destroying the very fabric and basis of Palestinian life in Gaza. Israel is thereby deliberately inflicting on the Palestinian group in Gaza conditions of life calculated to bring about its destruction. 8. Imposing measures intended to prevent Palestinian births. 95. As set out above, Israel's actions are impacting Palestinian women and children in Gaza especially severely, with 70% of those killed estimated to be women and children. 2 mothers are estimated to be killed every hour in Gaza. Over 7,729 children were estimated to have been killed by the 11th of December, 2023 alone, and at least 4,700 other women and children are reported missing, believed to be buried under the rubble. There are multiple eyewitness accounts of pregnant women being killed by Israeli soldiers, including while trying to access healthcare. 96. Pregnant women and children, including newborn babies, are also particularly impacted by displacement, lack of access to food and water, shelter, clothes, hygiene and sanitation, and lack of access to health services. These effects are severe and significant. An estimated 5,500 of approximately 52,000 pregnant Palestinian women in Gaza giving birth each month are doing so in unsafe conditions, often with no clean water, much less medical assistance, in shelters, in their homes, in the streets amid rubble, or in overwhelmed healthcare facilities, where sanitation is worsening, and the risk of infection and medical complications is on the rise. Where they are able to get to a functioning hospital, pregnant women are having to undergo cesarean sections without anesthetic. 97. Given the lack of access to critical medical supplies, including blood, doctors are being compelled to perform ordinarily unnecessary hysterectomies on young women in an attempt to save their lives, leaving them unable to have more children. Indeed, the Minister of Health for the State of Palestine, Dr. May al-Khaileh, confirms that the only option facing Palestinian women in Gaza who bleed out after giving birth is to undergo a hysterectomy in order for their lives to be saved. The lack of available drugs, such as the anti-D injection given to rhesus-negative women on the birth of a rhesus-positive baby, also seriously impacts the possibility of future healthy pregnancies for affected women. 98. Premature births have reportedly increased by between 25 to 30%, as stressed and traumatized pregnant women face a myriad of challenges, including being compelled to walk long distances in search of safety, attempting to escape from bombs and being crowded into shelters in often squalid conditions. Particularly in northern Gaza, Cases of placenta abruption, a serious condition that occurs to pregnant women during childbirth which is potentially life-threatening to both mother and baby, have more than doubled. 99. An ever-increasing number of Palestinian babies in Gaza are reportedly dying from entirely preventable causes, brought about by Israel's actions. Newborns up to 3 months old are dying of diarrhea, hypothermia, and other preventable causes. Without essential equipment and medical support, premature and underweight babies have little to no chance of survival. Palestinian newborn babies have died due to the lack of fuel to supply hospital generators. Others have been found decomposing in their hospital cots, medical staff taking care of them having been forced by Israel to evacuate. 100. On the 3rd of November, 2023, the World Health Organization warned that maternal deaths are expected to increase given the lack of access to adequate care, with deadly consequences on reproductive health, including a rise in stress-induced miscarriages, stillbirths, and premature births. For 37, the impact will necessarily be long-lasting and severe for Palestinians in Gaza as a group. By the 22nd of November, 2023, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women and Girls, its causes and consequences, has expressly warned that the reproductive violence inflicted by Israel on Palestinian women, newborn babies, infants, and children could be qualified as acts of genocide under Article 2 of the Convention on the Prevention of Genocide, including imposing measures intended to prevent births within a group. She stressed that states must prevent and punish such acts in accordance with their responsibilities under the Genocide Convention. D. Expressions of genocidal intent against the Palestinian people by Israeli state officials and others. 101. Evidence of Israeli state officials' specific intent, dolus specialis, to commit and persist in committing genocidal acts or to fail to prevent them has been significant and overt since October 2023. Those statements of intent, when combined with the level of killing, maiming, displacement and destruction on the ground, together with the siege evidence and unfolding and continuing genocide. They include statements by the following individuals in the positions of the highest responsibility. Prime Minister of Israel, on the 7th of October, 2023, in a televised address by the government press office, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu promised to operate forcefully everywhere. On the 13th of October, 2023, he confirmed that we are striking our enemies with unprecedented might. On the 15th of October, 2023, when Israeli airstrikes had already killed over 2,670 Palestinians, including 724 children, the Prime Minister stated that Israeli soldiers understand the scope of the mission and stand ready to defeat the bloodthirsty monsters who have risen against Israel to destroy us. On the 16th of October, 2023, in a formal address to the Israeli Knesset, he described the situation as a struggle between the children of light and the children of darkness, between humanity and the law of the jungle, a dehumanizing theme to which he returned on various occasions, including, on the 3rd of November, 2023, in a letter to Israeli soldiers and officers also published on the platform X, formerly Twitter. The letter asserted that, "This is the war between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. We will not let up on our mission until the light overcomes the darkness. The good will defeat the extreme evil that threatens us and the entire world." The Israeli Prime Minister also returned to the theme in his Christmas message, stating, "We're facing monsters who murdered children in front of their parents. This is a battle not only of Israel against these barbarians, it's a battle of civilization against barbarism." On the 28th of October, 2023, as Israeli forces prepared their land invasion of Gaza, the Prime Minister invoked the biblical story of the total destruction of Amalek by the Israelites, stating, "You must remember what Amalek has done to you, says our Holy Bible. And we do remember." The Prime Minister referred again to Amalek in the letter sent on the 3rd of November, 2023 to Israeli soldiers and officers. The relevant biblical passage reads as follows, "Now go, attack Amalek, and prescribe all that belongs to him. Spare no one, but kill alike men and women, infants and sucklings, oxen and sheep, camels and asses." President of Israel, on the 12th of October, 2023, President Isaac Herzog made clear that Israel was not distinguishing between militants and civilians in Gaza, stating in a press conference to foreign media in relation Palestinians in Gaza, over 1 million of whom are children, "It's an entire nation out there that is responsible. It's not true this rhetoric about civilians not aware, not involved. It's absolutely not true. And we will fight until we break their backbone." On the 15th of October, 2023, echoing the words of Prime Minister Netanyahu, the president told foreign media that we will uproot evil so that there will be good for the entire region and the world. For 50, the Israeli president is one of many Israelis to have handwritten messages on bombs to be dropped on Gaza. Israeli Minister of Defense, on the 9th of October, 2023, Defense Minister Yoav Gallant in an Israeli army situation update advised that Israel was imposing a complete siege on Gaza. No electricity, no food, no water, no fuel. Everything is closed. We are fighting human animals and we are acting accordingly. He also informed troops on the Gaza border that he had released all the restraints, stating in terms that Gaza won't return to what it was before. We will eliminate everything. If it doesn't take one day, it will take a week. It will take weeks or even months, we will reach all places. He further announced that Israel was moving to a full-scale response and that he had removed every restriction on Israeli forces. Israeli Minister for National Security, on the 10th of November, 2023, Itamar Ben-Gvir clarified the government's position in a televised address, stating, "To be clear, when we say that Hamas should be destroyed, it also means those who celebrate, those who support, and those who hand out candy, they're all terrorists, and they should also be destroyed." For 56. Israeli Minister of Energy and Infrastructure, tweeting on the 13th of October, 2023, Israel Katz stated, "All the civilian population in Gaza is ordered to leave immediately. We will win. They will not receive a drop of water or a single battery until they leave the world." On the 12th of October, 2023, he tweeted, "Humanitarian aid to Gaza. No electrical switch will be turned on, no water hydrant will be opened and no fuel truck will enter until the Israeli abductees are returned home. Humanitarianism for humanitarianism. And no one will preach us morality." For 58. Israeli Minister of Finance, on the 8th of October, 2023, Bezalel Smotrich stated at a meeting of the Israeli cabinet that we need to deal a blow that hasn't been seen in 50 years and take down Gaza. Israeli Minister of Heritage, on the 1st of November, 2023, Amichai Eliyahu posted on Facebook, "The north of the Gaza Strip, more beautiful than ever. Everything is blown up and flattened, simply a pleasure for the eyes. We must talk about the day after. In my mind, we will hand over lots to all those who fought for Gaza over the years and to those evicted from Gush Katif for former Israeli settlement." He later argued against humanitarian aid as we wouldn't hand the Nazis humanitarian aid, and there is no such thing as uninvolved civilians in Gaza. He also posited a nuclear attack on the Gaza Strip. Israeli Minister of Agriculture, on the 11th of November, 2023, Avi Dikta in a television interview recalled the Nakba of 1948, in which over 80% of the Palestinian population of the new Israeli state was forced from or fled their homes, stating that we are now actually rolling out the Gaza Nakba. Deputy Speaker of the Knesset and member of the Foreign Affairs and Security Committee, on the 7th of October, 2023, Nissim Vatyui tweeted that, "Now we all have one common goal: erasing the Gaza Strip from the face of the earth. Those who are unable will be replaced." 102. Similar statements have been made by Israeli army officials, advisors, and spokespersons, and others engaging with Israeli troops being deployed in Gaza. Israeli Army Coordinator of Government Activities in the Territories, Kogat, on the 9th of October, 2023, in a video statement addressed to Hamas and Gaza residents, published by COGAT's official channel, Major General Ghassan Alian warned, "Hamas became ISIS and the citizens of Gaza are celebrating instead of being horrified. Human animals are dealt with accordingly. Israel has imposed a total blockade on Gaza, no electricity, no water, just damage. You wanted hell, you will get hell. For 65. Israeli Army Reservist Major General, former head of the Israeli National Security Council, and advisor to the Defense Minister, on the 7th of October, 2023, Jura Island, describing the Israeli order to cut off water and electricity to Gaza, wrote in an online journal, "This is what Israel has begun to do. We cut the supply of energy, water and diesel to the Strip. But it's not enough. In order to make the siege effective, we have to prevent others from giving assistance to Gaza. The people should be told that they have two choices, to stay and to starve, or to leave. If Egypt and other countries prefer that these people will perish in Gaza, this is their choice." On the same day, he asserted in a national newspaper that when you are at war with another country, you don't feed them, you don't provide them electricity or gas or water or anything else. A country can be attacked in a much broader way, to bring the country to the brink of dysfunction. This is the necessary outcome of events in Gaza. He has repeatedly asserted the benefits for Israel of the creation of a humanitarian crisis in Gaza, stating that Israel has no interest in the Gaza Strip being rehabilitated, and this is an important point that needs to be made clear to the Americans, and that if we ever want to see the hostages alive, the only way is to create a severe humanitarian crisis in Gaza. He has indicated that water should be targeted, noting that water in Gaza comes from wells with salt water unfit for consumption. They have water treatment plants. Israel should hit those plants. When the entire world says we have gone insane and this is a humanitarian disaster, we will say, it's not an end, it's a means. In a Times radio interview on the 12th of October, 2023, he reiterated the army should create such a huge pressure on Gaza, that Gaza will become an area where people cannot live. People cannot live until Hamas is destroyed, which means that Israel not only stops to supply energy, diesel, water, food as we did in the last 20 years. But we should prevent any possible assistance by others, and to create in Gaza such a terrible, unbearable situation, that can last weeks and months. Jura Island has repeatedly been given a media platform to call for Gaza to be made uninhabitable, declaring the State of Israel has no choice but to make Gaza a place that is temporarily, or permanently, impossible to live in. In an interview on the 6th of November, 2023, he suggested that, if there is an intention for a military action at Shifa Hospital, which I think is inescapable, I hope that the head of the CIA got an explanation of why this is necessary, and why the US must ultimately back even an operation like this, even if there are thousands of bodies of civilians in the streets afterward. Further, he proposed that Israel needs to create a humanitarian crisis in Gaza, compelling tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands to seek refuge in Egypt or the Gulf. Gaza will become a place where no human being can exist. Echoing the words of President Herzog, he has repeatedly underscored that there should be no distinction between Hamas combatants and Palestinian civilians, saying, "Who are the poor women of Gaza? They are all the mothers, sisters, or wives of Hamas murderers. On the one hand, they are part of the infrastructure that supports the organization, and on the other hand, if they experience a humanitarian disaster, then it can be assumed that some of the Hamas fighters and the more junior commanders will begin to understand that the war is futile. The international community warns us of a humanitarian disaster in Gaza and of severe epidemics. We must not shy away from this, as difficult as that may be. After all, severe epidemics in the south of the Gaza Strip will bring victory closer. It is precisely its civil collapse that will bring the end of the war closer. When senior Israeli figures say in the media it's either us or them, we should clarify the question of who is them. They are not only Hamas fighters with weapons, but also all the civilian officials, including hospital administrators and school administrators, and also the entire Gaza population who enthusiastically supported Hamas and cheered on its atrocities on October 7. Israeli Army Reservist Motivational Speech, on the 11th of October, 2023, 95-year-old Israeli army reservist Ezra Yashin, a veteran of the Deir Yassin massacre during the 1948 Nakba, reportedly called up for reserve duty to boost morale amongst Israeli troops ahead of the ground invasion, was broadcast on social media inciting other soldiers to genocide as follows: while being driven around in an Israeli army vehicle, dressed in Israeli army fatigues. Be triumphant and finish them off and don't leave anyone behind. Erase the memory of them. Erase them, their families, mothers and children. These animals can no longer live. Every Jew with a weapon should go out and kill them. If you have an Arab neighbor, don't wait, go to his home and shoot him. We want to invade, not like before. We want to enter and destroy what's in front of us, and destroy houses, then destroy the one after it. With all of our forces, complete destruction, enter and destroy. As you can see, we will witness things we've never dreamed of. Let them drop bombs on them and erase them. Head of the Israeli Army's Air Operations Group, on the 28th of October, 2023, Lieutenant Colonel Gilad Kinan described the Air Force as working together with all the bodies in the IDF when the goal is clear to destroy everything that has been touched by the hand of Hamas. Commander in the 2908th Battalion of the Israeli Army, in a video posted online on the 21st of December, 2023, Yoav Ben David said that the Israeli army had entered Beit Hanoun and did there as Shimon and Levi did in Nablus, and that the entire Gaza should resemble Beit Hanoun, referring to the city in northern Gaza which has been entirely devastated by the Israeli army. The biblical passage in issue reads, "On the third day, when they were in pain, Simeon and Levi, two of Jacob's sons, brothers of Dinah, took each his sword, came upon the city unmolested, and slew all the males." 103. The above statements by Israeli decision-makers and military officials indicate in and of themselves a clear intent to destroy Palestinians in Gaza as a group as such. They also constitute clear direct and public incitement to genocide, which has gone unchecked and unpunished. The clear inference from the acts of the Israeli army on the ground, including from the vast number of civilians killed and injured, and the scale of displacement, destruction and devastation wrought in Gaza, is that those genocidal statements and directives are being implemented against the Palestinian people. That is also the clear and necessary inference to be drawn from the emerging evidence from Israeli army soldiers serving in Gaza, including those stationed on the ground. Israeli Army Colonel, Deputy Head of Kogat, speaking in a video filmed in Beit Lahia, one of the areas of Gaza which appears to have suffered particularly severe levels of destruction, and broadcast on Israeli television on the 4th of November, 2023, Colonel Yoav Bosheshit stated, "Whoever returns here, if they return hereafter, will find scorched earth. No houses, no agriculture, no nothing. They have no future." Another army colonel recorded in the same video, Colonel Erez Eshel, Reserve, also commented that, "Vengeance is a great value. There is vengeance over what they did to us. This place will be a fallow land. They will not be able to live here." Israeli army soldiers, Israeli soldiers in uniform have been filmed on the 5th of December, 2023 dancing, chanting and singing "May their village burn, may Gaza be erased," and, 2 days later, on a separate occasion inside Gaza on the 7th of December, 2023, dancing, singing and chanting, "We know our motto, there are no uninvolved civilians and to wipe off the seed of Amalek." 483-104. Notably, the second video of soldiers chanting that there are no uninvolved citizens in Gaza and that they will wipe off the seed of Amalek was filmed on the 7th of December, 2023. By that date, 17,177 Palestinians in Gaza had been killed, an estimated 70% of whom were women and children. 7 to 8 December 2023 was particularly devastating for Palestinians, with 350 people killed in the space of 24 hours, approximately one Palestinian in Gaza killed every 4 minutes. 105. This genocidal rhetoric of governmental and military officials is also widespread and commonplace amongst non-cabinet members of the Israeli Knesset, MKs, who have repeatedly called for Gaza to be wiped out, flattened, erased, and crushed on all its inhabitants. Parliamentarians have publicly deplored anyone feeling sorry for the uninvolved Gazans, asserting repeatedly that there are no uninvolved, that there are no innocents in Gaza, that the killers of the women and children should not be separated from the citizens of Gaza, that the children of Gaza have brought this upon themselves, and that there should be one sentence for everyone their death. Parliamentarians have stated we must not forget that even the innocent citizens, the cruel and monstrous people from Gaza, took an active part. There is no place for any humanitarian gesture. The memory of Amalek must be protested, and that without hunger and thirst among the Gazan population, we will not be able to recruit collaborators. Parliamentarians have also called for mercilessly bombing from the air, calling for the use of nuclear, doomsday, weapons, and a Nakba that will overshadow the Nakba of 48. 106. Similar genocidal rhetoric is also commonplace in Israeli civil society, with genocidal messages being routinely broadcast without censure or sanction in Israeli media. The media reports call for Gaza to be erased, turned into a slaughterhouse, that Hamas should not be eliminated but rather Gaza should be razed, on the repeated claim that there are no innocents. There is no population. There are 2.5 million terrorists. One local official reportedly called for Gaza to be desolate and destroyed like the Auschwitz Museum, demonstrating the madness of the people who live there. Former MKs have called for a level of destruction akin to that of Dresden and Hiroshima, asserting that it would be immoral for the Israeli army not to show themselves to be vengeful and cruel. In an Israeli news interview, one former MK called for all Palestinians in Gaza to be killed, saying, "I tell you, in Gaza without exception, they are all terrorists, sons of dogs. They must be exterminated, all of them killed. We will flatten Gaza, turn them to dust, and the army will cleanse the area. Then we will start building new areas, for us, above all, for our security." 107. Those statements by prominent members of Israeli society, including former parliamentarians and news anchors, constitute clear, direct and public incitement to genocide, which has gone unchecked and unpunished by the Israeli authorities. That such sentiment appears to be so widespread and mainstream in Israeli society is of particular concern, in circumstances where the soldiers serving in Gaza are largely reservists, drawn from and informed by civil society. Recognition of Israel's genocidal intent against Palestinians. 108. As set out above, numerous states have rightly recognized Israel's statements in relation to Gaza as demonstrating genocidal intent. That assessment is shared by a significant number of United Nations experts who have repeatedly warned since at least mid-October 2023 that the Palestinian people are at grave risk of genocide by Israel. By way of example, on the 19th of October, 2023, 9 United Nations special rapporteurs sounded the alarm, warning that there is an ongoing campaign by Israel resulting in crimes against humanity in Gaza. Considering statements made by Israeli political leaders and their allies, accompanied by military action in Gaza and escalation of arrests and killing in the West Bank, there is also a risk of genocide against the Palestine people. On the 27th of October, 2023, the United Nations Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination underscored that it was highly concerned about the sharp increase in racist hate speech and dehumanization directed at Palestinians since the 7th of October, particularly on the internet and in social media, including by senior officials, politicians, members of the parliament, and public figures, particularly the statement of the 9th of October made by the Israeli Minister of Defense, Yoav Gallant, in which he referred to Palestinians as human animals, language which could incite genocidal actions. On the 28th of October, 2023, the director of the New York office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights, OHCHR, stepped down, after penning a widely reported resignation statement describing the situation in Gaza as a textbook case of genocide. On the 2nd of November, 2023, 8 special rapporteurs warned that they remain convinced that the Palestinian people are at grave risk of genocide. The experts stated that the time for action is now, underscoring that Israel's allies also bear responsibility and must act now to prevent its disastrous course of action. On the 16th of November, 2023, 15 United Nations Special Rapporteurs and 21 members of United Nations working groups cautioned that grave violations committed by Israel against Palestinians in the aftermath of the 7th of October, particularly in Gaza, point to a genocide in the making. The statement highlights evidence of increasing genocidal incitement, overt intent to destroy the Palestinian people under occupation, loud calls for a second Nakba in Gaza and the rest of the occupied Palestinian territory, and the use of powerful weaponry with inherently indiscriminate impacts, resulting in a colossal death toll and destruction of life-sustaining infrastructure. The experts expressed profound concern about the failure of the international system to mobilize to prevent genocide, cautioning that the failure to urgently implement a ceasefire risks this situation spiraling towards a genocide conducted with 21st-century means and methods of warfare. They called on the international community, including not only states but also non-state actors, to do everything it can to immediately end the risk of genocide against the Palestinian people. On the 20th of November, 2023, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women and Girls, its causes and consequences, issued a statement warning that since the 7th of October, the assault on Palestinian women's dignity and rights has taken on new and terrifying dimensions, as thousands have become victims of war crimes, crimes against humanity and an unfolding genocide. The Special Rapporteur expressed alarm at the genocidal and dehumanizing rhetoric about the Palestinian people, including women and children, by top Israeli government officials and public figures calling them children of darkness. The Special Rapporteur referred to the description of Palestinians as human animals and the calls for a second Nakba by Israeli officials, cautioning that such statements make the Israeli government's intention to destroy the Palestinian people, in whole or in part, absolutely and consistently clear. On the 8th of December, 2023, ahead of the United Nations Security Council ceasefire resolution vote vetoed by the United States of America, 22 United Nations Special Rapporteurs and 28 members of United Nations working groups reiterated their previous statement warning against the commission of genocide. On the 21st of December, 2023, the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, acting under its early warning and urgent action procedure, reiterating its earlier statement and warning of hate speech and dehumanizing discourse targeted at Palestinians, raising severe concerns regarding Israel's and other state parties' obligation to prevent genocide. The committee called on all state parties to fully respect their international obligations, in particular those arising from the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, and to cooperate to bring an end to the violations that are taking place and to prevent genocide. The committee made detailed reference to the ongoing situation in Gaza, stating inter alia that it was gravely concerned about the racist hate speech, incitement to violence and genocidal actions, as well as dehumanizing rhetoric targeted at Palestinians since the 7th of October, 2023 by Israeli senior government officials, members of the parliament, politicians, and public figures. 109. The Organization of Islamic Cooperation has repeatedly condemned Israel's military actions in Gaza as genocide, as has the Arab Group at the United Nations. The International Federation for Human Rights have called for an end to the genocide, with the International Commission of Jurists calling on third states to take all reasonable measures within their power to prevent genocide in Gaza. Palestinian non-governmental organizations have also strongly condemned the genocide, calling on the International Criminal Court to investigate the crime. The Palestinian Human Rights Organizations Council on the 14th of November, 2023 issued a detailed briefing note calling on the State of Palestine and third states to intervene, taking concrete measures and legal action to prevent genocide in Gaza. The report cautions that there have been significant warnings by United Nations independent human rights experts, as well as actions taken by third states, including the removal of their diplomatic missions from Israel, some in response to the ongoing Israeli genocidal statements and acts. Together, these warnings and state actions put the international community of states on notice that there is a very real risk that genocide is being, or may be committed against Palestinians in Gaza. Part 4. The Claims of South Africa. 110. Based on the above, as well as the further evidence to be presented over the course of these proceedings, South Africa considers that the conduct of Israel through its state organs, state agents, and other persons and entities acting on its instructions or under its direction, control or influence in relation to Palestinians in Gaza, is in violation of its obligations under the Genocide Convention, including Articles I, 3, 4, V and 6, read in conjunction with Article 2. Those violations of the Genocide Convention include, but are not limited to: a. Failing to prevent genocide in violation of Article 1. b. Committing genocide in violation of Article 3, a. c. Conspiring to commit genocide in violation of Article 3, b. d. Direct and public incitement to commit genocide in violation of Article 3, c. e. Attempting to commit genocide in violation of Article 3, d. f. Complicity in genocide in violation of Article 3, e. g. Failing to punish genocide, conspiracy to commit genocide, direct and public incitement to genocide, attempted genocide, and complicity in genocide, in violation of Articles I, 3, 4 and 6. h. Failing to enact the necessary legislation to give effect to the provisions of the Genocide Convention and to provide effective penalties for persons guilty of genocide, conspiracy to commit genocide, incitement to genocide, attempted genocide, and complicity in genocide, in violation of Article 5, and I. Failing to allow and or directly or indirectly impeding the investigation by competent international bodies or fact-finding missions of genocidal acts committed against Palestinians in Gaza, including those Palestinians removed by Israeli state agents or forces to Israel, as a necessary and corollary obligation pursuant to Articles I, 3, 4, V and 6. Part 5. The relief sought. 111. While reserving the right to revise, supplement or amend this application, and subject to the presentation to the court of the relevant evidence and legal arguments, South Africa respectfully requests the court to adjudge and declare: 1. That the Republic of South Africa and the State of Israel each have a duty to act in accordance with their obligations under the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, in relation to the members of the Palestinian group, to take all reasonable measures within their power to prevent genocide, and 2. That the State of Israel a. Has breached and continues to breach its obligations under the Genocide Convention, in particular the obligations provided under Article 1, read in conjunction with Article 2, and Articles 3a, 3b, 3c, 3d, 3e, 4v and 6. b. Must cease forthwith any acts and measures in breach of those obligations, including such acts or measures which would be capable of killing or continuing to kill Palestinians, or causing or continuing to cause serious bodily or mental harm to Palestinians, or deliberately inflicting on their group, or continuing to inflict on their group, conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, and fully respect its obligations under the Genocide Convention. In particular the obligations provided under Articles I, 3a, 3b, 3c, 3d, 3e, 4v and 6. c. Must ensure that persons committing genocide, conspiring to commit genocide, directly and publicly inciting genocide, attempting to commit genocide and complicit in genocide contrary to Articles I, 3a, 3b, 3c, 3d, and 3e, are punished by a competent national or international tribunal, as required by Articles I, 4, V and 6. d. To that end and in furtherance of those obligations arising under Articles I, 4, V and 6, must collect and conserve evidence and ensure, allow and or not inhibit directly or indirectly the collection and conservation of evidence of genocidal acts committed against Palestinians in Gaza, including such members of the group displaced from Gaza. e. Must perform the obligations of reparation in the interest of Palestinian victims, including but not limited to allowing the safe and dignified return of forcibly displaced and or abducted Palestinians to their homes, respect for their full human rights and protection against further discrimination, persecution, and other related acts, and provide for the reconstruction of what it has destroyed in Gaza, consistent with the obligation to prevent genocide under Article 1, and f. must offer assurances and guarantees of non-repetition of violations of the Genocide Convention, in particular the obligations provided under Articles I, 3a, 3b, 3c, 3d, 3e, 4v and 6. Part 6. Request for Provisional Measures. 112. In accordance with Article 41 of the Statute of the Court, and Articles 73, 74 and 75 of the Rules of Court, South Africa requests that the Court indicate provisional measures. In light of the nature of the rights in issue, as well as the ongoing, extreme and irreparable harm being suffered by Palestinians in Gaza, South Africa requests that the Court address this request as a matter of extreme urgency. 113. This application describes an exceptionally brutal military campaign by Israel in Gaza, which is extensive and ongoing, and which Israel intends to intensify further still. 114. Israel has engaged in and failed to prevent or to punish acts and measures which are genocidal, constituting flagrant violations of Israel's obligations under Articles I, 3a, 3b, 3c, 3d, 3e, 4. V and 6 of the Genocide Convention. As further evidenced in the materials set out in the application, the acts of genocide in question in breach of Articles 2a, 2b, 2c, and 2d, in particular, that collectively target the Palestinians in Gaza include, inter alia. 1. Killing Palestinians in Gaza, including a large proportion of women and children estimated to account for around 70% of the more than 21,110 fatalities, some of whom appear to have been summarily executed. 2. Causing serious mental and bodily harm to Palestinians in Gaza, including through maiming, psychological trauma, and inhuman and degrading treatment. 3. Causing the forced evacuation and displacement of around 85% of Palestinians in Gaza, including children, the elderly and infirm, and the sick and wounded, as well as causing the large-scale destruction of Palestinian homes, villages, refugee camps, towns, and entire areas in Gaza, precluding the return of a significant proportion of the Palestinian people to their homes. 4. Causing widespread hunger, dehydration, and starvation to besieged Palestinians in Gaza, through the impeding of sufficient humanitarian assistance, the cutting off of sufficient water, food, fuel and electricity, and the destruction of bakeries, mills, agricultural lands, and other methods of production and sustenance. 5. Failing to provide and restricting the provision of adequate shelter, clothes, hygiene or sanitation to Palestinians in Gaza, including the 1.9 million internally displaced people, compelled by Israel's actions to live in dangerous situations of squalor, alongside the routine targeting and destruction of places of shelter and the killing and wounding of those sheltering, including women, children, the disabled and the elderly. 6. Failing to provide for or to ensure the provision for the medical needs of Palestinians in Gaza, including those medical needs created by other genocidal acts causing serious bodily harm, including through directly attacking Palestinian hospitals, ambulances, and other healthcare facilities in Gaza, killing Palestinian doctors, medics, and nurses, including the most qualified medics in Gaza, and destroying and disabling Gaza's medical system, and 7. Destroying Palestinian life in Gaza, through the destruction of Gaza's universities, schools, courts, public buildings, public records, stores, libraries, churches, mosques, roads, infrastructure, utilities, and other facilities necessary to the sustained life of Palestinians in Gaza as a group, alongside the killing of entire family groups, erasing entire oral histories in Gaza, and the killing of prominent and distinguished members of society. 8. Imposing measures intended to prevent Palestinian births in Gaza, through the reproductive violence inflicted on Palestinian women, newborn babies, infants, and children. 115. Provisional measures are necessary in this case to protect against further, severe, and irreparable harm to the rights of the Palestinian people under the Genocide Convention, which continue to be violated with impunity. South Africa requests that the court indicate provisional measures to protect and preserve those rights as well as its own rights under the Convention, and to prevent any aggravation or extension of the dispute, pending the determination of the merits of the issues raised by the application. 116. South Africa notes that there are other related matters that do not directly engage obligations under the Genocide Convention and are therefore not properly within the court's jurisdiction in this case, including the urgent return of Israeli and other hostages. South Africa considers that the provisional measures requested are nevertheless consistent with and capable of assisting towards the progression and resolution of those matters. A. Compelling circumstances require the indication of provisional measures. 117. As detailed above, contrary to Article 1 of the Convention, Israel has perpetrated and is perpetrating genocidal acts identified in Article 2. Israel, its officials and/or agents, have acted with the intent to destroy Palestinians in Gaza, part of a protected group under the Genocide Convention. The compelling circumstances are set out in detail in the application, and include that nowhere is safe in Gaza. Israel is dropping dumb bombs and bombs weighing up to 2,000 pounds, 900 kilograms on one of the most densely populated places in the world. Palestinians in Gaza are being killed at a rate of approximately one person every 6 minutes. At least 21,110 Palestinians have been killed to date in Gaza, with a further estimated 7,780 are missing, presumed dead under the rubble. An estimated 7,729 Palestinian children had already been killed by the 12th of December, 2023. At least 4,700 other children and women are reported missing, presumed dead under the rubble, leading UNICEF to describe Israel's military attacks as a war against children. Hundreds of Palestinians in Gaza are being wounded daily, many with life-changing and life-threatening injuries. Besieged and bombed hospitals are no longer able to treat the sick and wounded. Only 13 of Gaza's 36 hospitals are still functioning. 1.9 million Palestinians in Gaza, approximately 85% of the population, have been forcibly displaced from their homes. Palestinians in Gaza are being corralled into ever smaller areas of Gaza, without sufficient shelter, where they continue to be bombed by Israel. Israel continues to prevent sufficient humanitarian assistance to Palestinians in Gaza, including preventing sufficient access to food, water, shelter, medicine, and medical assistance. Vulnerable Palestinians, including the sick and infirm, children and expectant mothers, are at particular risk. Infectious diseases are spreading rapidly. International experts are warning of imminent mass starvation. 118. Israel has also failed to prevent or to punish genocide, conspiracy to commit genocide, direct and public incitement to genocide, attempted genocide, and complicity in genocide, contrary to Articles 3 and 4 of the Genocide Convention. 119. Israel denies wrongdoing in relation to its military activities in Gaza and is resisting all calls by South Africa and by the broader international community to prevent and cease the commission of genocide. Instead of ceasing violations of the Genocide Convention, preventing such violations and punishing their perpetrators, Israel has continued, escalated, and threatened further to escalate its military campaign. It is also destroying evidence of its wrongdoing. The mass demolition and clearance of vast areas of Gaza, and the prevention of the return of internally displaced Palestinians to their homes, raises serious concerns about the destruction of evidence and its effect on future investigation into crimes, including the gravest crimes under international law. Israel's killing of large numbers of Palestinian journalists and media workers in Gaza, at least 82 to date, often alongside multiple members of their families, coupled with its attacks on Gaza's telecommunications network, are hampering scrutiny of Israel's actions against Palestinians in Gaza. So too is Israel's continuing refusal to allow access to Gaza by fact-finders and foreign journalists, other than a limited number of journalists permitted to embed themselves with the Israeli army, subject to restrictions and censorship of their reports. Palestinian NGOs and human rights defenders, themselves at risk of attack by the Israeli army, are not able to document in real time the unremitting acts of genocide and other violations of international law being committed by Israel. b. The prima facie jurisdiction of the court. 120. The court is empowered to indicate provisional measures if the provisions relied on by the applicant appear prima facie to afford a basis on which its jurisdiction could be founded, but need not satisfy itself in a definitive manner that it has jurisdiction as regards the merits of the case. 121. As set out above, the jurisdiction of the court is founded on Article 36, Para 1, of the Statute of the Court and Article 9 of the Genocide Convention. Article 9 of Genocide Convention provides, disputes between the contracting parties relating to the interpretation, application, or fulfillment of the present convention, including those relating to the responsibility of a state for genocide or for any of the other acts enumerated in Article 3, shall be submitted to the International Court of Justice at the request of any of the parties to the dispute. 122. South Africa and Israel are both United Nations member states and state parties to the Genocide Convention. Both have accepted the jurisdiction of the court under Article 9 of the Genocide Convention without any reservation. They are consequently bound by it. 123. In order for this court to determine whether it has prima facie jurisdiction in order to indicate provisional measures, the matters complained of must themselves be prima facie capable of falling within the provisions of the Convention, such that the dispute is one which the court has jurisdiction ration materie to entertain. The case law of the court establishes that a dispute is a disagreement on a point of law or fact, a conflict of legal views or of interests between parties. In order for a dispute to exist, it must be shown that the claim of one party is positively opposed by the other. 525. The two sides must hold clearly opposite views concerning the question of the performance or non-performance of certain international obligations. The existence of a dispute is a matter for objective determination by the court. It is a matter of substance, and not a question of form or procedure. For the purposes of deciding whether there was a dispute between the parties at the time of the filing of the application, the court takes into account in particular any statements or documents exchanged between the parties, as well as any exchanges made in multilateral settings. In so doing, it pays special attention to the author of the statement or document, their intended or actual addressee, and their content. 124. For the purposes of the indication of provisional measures, the court is not required to ascertain whether any violation of Israel's obligations under the Genocide Convention has occurred. 529. Importantly, as previously held by the court, such a finding, which would notably depend on the assessment of the existence of an intent to destroy, in whole or in part, the group of Palestinians as such, could be made by the court only at the stage of the examination of the merits of the present case. Instead, what the court is required to do at the stage of making an order on provisional measures is to establish whether the acts complained of are capable of falling within the provisions of the Genocide Convention. The court does not have to determine that all of the acts complained of are capable of falling within the provisions of the Convention. It suffices that at least some of the acts alleged are capable of falling within the provisions of the Convention. 125. At least some of the acts alleged by South Africa are plainly capable of falling within the provisions of the Convention. They have been considered to be capable of falling within the provisions of the Convention by numerous states and United Nations experts and bodies, including the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. Notably, they are plainly capable of falling within the provisions of Article 2A, 2B, 2C, and 2D of the Convention, constituting as they do: 1. The killing of Palestinians in Gaza, 2. Their serious bodily or mental harm, 3. The deliberate infliction of conditions of life calculated to bring about the destruction of Palestinians in Gaza, and 4. The imposition of measures intended to prevent births within the group. In relation to 2C, the court has previously explained this as including methods of physical destruction, other than killing, whereby the perpetrator ultimately seeks the death of the members of the group. Citing jurisprudence from international tribunals, the court held that such methods of destruction include notably deprivation of food, medical care, shelter or clothing, as well as lack of hygiene, systematic expulsion from homes, or exhaustion as a result of excessive work or physical exertion. Those international tribunals have also identified the following methods of destruction: subjecting the group to a subsistence diet, failing to provide adequate medical care, and generally creating circumstances that would lead to a slow death, such as the lack of proper food, water, shelter, clothing, sanitation. This court has also determined that forced mass displacement is capable of being considered a genocidal act. The materials relied on in this application constitute clear evidence of the creation by Israel of circumstances plainly capable of constituting those methods of destruction. 126. The evidence regarding the direct and public incitement to commit genocide by Israeli state officials, politicians, and others as set out above, and the failure by Israel to punish those responsible, are also plainly capable of falling within the provisions of Article 3 and 4 of the Convention. 127. The above-mentioned elements serve to establish prima facie the existence of a dispute between the parties relating to the interpretation, application, or fulfillment of the Genocide Convention. The dispute concerns Israel's breaches of its obligations under the Genocide Convention, including its failure to prevent and its perpetration of genocide, and South Africa's own obligations under the Genocide Convention to prevent genocide, including by taking actions to influence effectively the actions of persons likely to commit genocide. The court has described the nature of that dispute as follows: a state's obligations to prevent, and corresponding duty to act, arise at the instant that the state learns of, or should normally have learned of, the existence of a serious risk that genocide will be committed. From that moment onwards, if the state has available to it means likely to have a deterrent effect on those suspected of preparing genocide, or reasonably suspected of harboring specific intent, dolus specialis, it is under a duty to make use of these means as the circumstances permit. 128. The court plainly has prima facie jurisdiction to indicate provisional measures in this case as a consequence. C. The rights the protection of which is sought, their plausible character and the link between such rights and the measures requested. 129. The court has the power to indicate, if it considers that circumstances so require, any provisional measures which ought to be taken to preserve the respective rights of either party, pursuant to Article 41 of the Statute of the Court. The power of the court to indicate provisional measures has as its object the preservation of the respective rights claimed by the parties in a case, pending the court's decision on the merits thereof. It follows that the court must be concerned to preserve by such measures the rights which may subsequently be adjudged by it to belong to either party. At this stage of the proceedings, however, the court is not called upon to determine definitively whether the rights which South Africa seeks to protect exist. It need only decide whether it is satisfied that the rights asserted by South Africa on the merits, and for which it is seeking protection, are at least plausible i.e. grounded in a possible interpretation of the Convention. Those rights are clearly plausible, having regard inter alia to the statements of United Nations experts and bodies asserting that there is at the very least a real risk of genocide, which risk gives rise to the obligation to prevent genocide, pursuant to Article 1 of the Convention, which is binding on both Israel and South Africa. It also gives rise to obligations binding on Israel not to commit genocide, and to punish those who directly and publicly incite to genocide. 130. For the court to indicate one or more provisional measures, there must also be a link between the rights the protection of which is sought and the provisional measure being requested. Such a link clearly exists between the rights claimed by South Africa and the provisional measures requested, which are directly linked to the rights which form the subject matter of the dispute. 131. In relation to the nature of the rights asserted by South Africa under the Genocide Convention, as recently recalled by the court, in such a convention the contracting states do not have any interests of their own, they merely have, one and all, a common interest, namely, the accomplishment of those high purposes which are the raison d'etre of the convention. Consequently, in a convention of this type one cannot speak of individual advantages or disadvantages to states, or of the maintenance of a perfect contractual balance between rights and duties. The high ideals which inspired the convention provide, by virtue of the common will of the parties, the foundation and measure of all its provisions. 132. Having regard to their shared values, all the states parties to the Genocide Convention thus have a common interest to ensure that acts of genocide are prevented and that, if they occur, their authors do not enjoy impunity. As determined by the court, that common interest implies that the obligations in question are owed by any state party to all the other states parties to the convention. 549. As a consequence, the relevant provisions of the Genocide Convention generate obligations which may be defined as obligations erga omnes parties in the sense that each state party has an interest in compliance with them in any given case. Consequently, as recently confirmed by the court, it follows that any state party to the Genocide Convention, and not only a specially affected state, may invoke the responsibility of another state party with a view to ascertaining the alleged failure to comply with its obligations erga omnes parties, and to bring that failure to an end. 133. South Africa seeks hereby, pursuant to that common interest urgently to protect the rights of Palestinians in Gaza, as members of a protected group under the Convention, including their right to exist as a group and their right to be protected from acts of genocide and the risk thereof, from conspiracy to commit genocide, from direct and public incitement to commit genocide, from attempted genocide, and from complicity in genocide. South Africa also seeks to protect the erga omnes parties' rights it has under the Genocide Convention as well as the erga omnes obligations it has to prevent genocide, which mirror the erga omnes obligations of the Convention with which it is entitled to seek compliance by Israel, including Israel's obligations not to commit genocide, to prevent genocide, and to punish genocide, including acts of genocide, conspiracy to commit genocide, direct and public incitement to genocide, attempted genocide and complicity in genocide against Palestinians. The court has previously recognized the universal character both of the condemnation of genocide and of the cooperation required in order to liberate mankind from such an odious scourge. 134. For the purposes of indicating provisional measures, the court does not need to establish definitively that Palestinians are at risk of genocide, that they are being subjected to genocidal acts, or that Israel is otherwise breaching its obligations under the Genocide Convention. Rather, it is sufficient that the obligation of South Africa to act to prevent genocide, or the right of South Africa to seek compliance by Israel with its obligations under the Convention not to commit genocide, and to prevent and punish genocide and related prohibited acts under the Convention, be plausible. Equally, there is no requirement, before granting provisional measures, for the court to ascertain whether the existence of a genocidal intent is the only inference to be drawn from the material before the court, as this requirement would amount to the court making a determination on the merits. Notably, the fact that the genocidal acts are occurring and not being prevented or punished in the course of an armed conflict or in asserted response to an attack by an armed group, has no bearing on whether the rights asserted by South Africa under the Genocide Convention are at least plausible. The absence of a prior determination of genocide by a court or fact-finding tribunal is similarly no bar to the adjudication by this court of an application under the Genocide Convention, much less a request for the indication of provisional measures. 135. The facts and circumstances described in this application and request for provisional measures establish that the acts complained of which Israel has committed and is committing are capable of being characterized at the very least as plausibly genocidal. The requisite dolus specialis can be deduced not only from Israel's conduct against Palestinians in Gaza, but also from clear, repeated dehumanizing statements by Israeli governmental and military officials towards them. Indeed, they have been so characterized by numerous heads of state and other state officials and representatives, as well as by a large number of United Nations experts and various expert human rights organizations and institutions who have repeatedly warned that Israel's actions amount to or risk the genocide of the Palestinian people. Consequently, the rights relied on by South Africa in its request for the indication of provisional measures are at the very least plausible. Indeed, their protection coincides with the very object and purposes of the Genocide Convention. D. The risk of irreparable prejudice and urgency. 136. The court has the power to indicate provisional measures when irreparable prejudice could be caused to rights which are the subject of judicial proceedings or when the alleged disregard of such rights may entail irreparable consequences. In particular, the court has the power to indicate provisional measures if there is urgency, in the sense that there is a real and imminent risk that irreparable prejudice will be caused before the court gives its final decision. As the court recently confirmed, the condition of urgency is met when the acts susceptible of causing irreparable prejudice can occur at any moment before the court makes a final decision on the case. 559-137. For the purposes of its decision on a request for the indication of provisional measures in a case involving allegations of violations of the Genocide Convention, the court is not called upon to establish the existence of breaches of the Genocide Convention, but to determine whether the circumstances require the indication of provisional measures for the protection of rights under this instrument, as found to be plausible. As held by the court, this does not require it to make definitive findings of fact or of imputability, and the right of each party to submit arguments in respect of the merits must remain unaffected by the court's decision on the request for the indication of provisional measures. 138. In assessing whether the condition of urgency is satisfied in cases involving allegations of genocide in the course of an ongoing conflict, the court typically has regard to whether the population at risk is particularly vulnerable, and the fragility of the overall situation, including the likelihood and the risk of the reoccurrence of harm. The court considers a civilian population to be extremely vulnerable where the military operations have resulted in numerous civilian deaths and injuries and have caused significant material damages, including the destruction of buildings and infrastructure, and where attacks are ongoing and are creating increasingly difficult living conditions for the civilian population. In indicating provisional measures, the court has considered the lack of access by many individuals to the most basic foodstuffs, potable water, electricity, essential medicines, or heating, 564, and attempts by a very large number of people to flee from the most affected cities under extremely insecure conditions. The court has also considered the following factors, raised by a United Nations General Assembly resolution, to be materially relevant in assessing whether the condition of urgency is satisfied in cases involving allegations of genocide, attacks on civilian facilities such as residences, schools, and hospitals, and of civilian casualties, including women, older persons, persons with disabilities, and children, the scale of military operations, including their comparison with other conflicts, the deteriorating humanitarian situation in a territory, and their increasing number of internally displaced persons and refugees in need of humanitarian assistance. Similarly, the court has had regard to findings of a fact-finding mission, considering factors such as the systematic stripping of human rights, dehumanizing narratives and rhetoric, methodical planning, mass killing, mass displacement, mass fear, overwhelming levels of brutality, combined with the physical destruction of the home of the targeted population, in every sense and on every level. 139. Notably, as the court has underscored, states parties to the Genocide Convention have expressly confirmed their willingness to consider genocide as a crime under international law which they must prevent and punish independently of the context of peace or of war in which it takes place. Consequently, a state remains bound by the obligations incumbent upon it as a state party to the Genocide Convention, regardless of the fact that there may be an ongoing conflict between armed groups and the military. Such a context does not stand in the way of the court's assessment of the existence of a real and imminent risk of irreparable prejudice to the rights protected under the Convention. 140. Where past violations have occurred, the court has found provisional measures appropriate when it is not inconceivable that they might occur again. The court has also ordered provisional measures in circumstances that were unstable and could rapidly change, with ongoing tension and the absence of an overall settlement to the conflict that meant the affected group remained vulnerable. Consequently, any ceasefire to be agreed or any other acts by Israel that could be perceived as capable of ameliorating the circumstances for Palestinians in the short term would not have a dispositive effect and would impact neither on the merit nor the urgency of South Africa's arguments. 141. There is a clear risk of irreparable prejudice to the rights of the Palestinians and to South Africa's own rights under the Genocide Convention. The utmost urgency of the situation is self-evident. Palestinians have suffered and are suffering irreparable harm from genocidal acts by Israel in violation of Article 2 of the Genocide Convention, and from Israel's other violations of the Convention, including its failure to prevent or punish direct and public incitement to genocide. Should these violations of the Genocide Convention go unchecked, there is not only a risk but a certainty of further significant and irreparable loss of life and property, serious injury, and an ever-deepening humanitarian crisis. The opportunity to collect and preserve evidence for the merit stage of the proceedings would also be seriously undermined, if not lost entirely. 142. As of the date of this application, an estimated 21,110 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza, including at least 7,729 children. 55,243 Palestinians have been injured, including at least 8,663 children, of whom over 1,000 are amputees, disabled for life. Approximately 70% of those killed are said to be women and children. One Palestinian child in Gaza has been killed approximately every 15 minutes since Israel commenced military action in Gaza on the 7th of October, 2023. Thousands more are missing under the rubble. 61 hospitals and healthcare facilities in Gaza have been damaged or destroyed, many have been placed under siege or have been subjected to forced evacuation, and only 13 hospitals are still partially functional, weighed under by mass overcrowding. 311 health workers have been killed, many while working, meaning that many of the wounded, including seriously injured children, cannot access healthcare. An estimated 5,500 women are having to give birth in unsafe conditions every month. Babies are dying from preventable causes. In addition to disease and malnutrition, premature babies have died due to lack of fuel to supply hospital generators. Others have been found decomposing in their hospital cots, medical staff having been forced to evacuate. Over 60% of homes in Gaza have been damaged or destroyed. Vast swathes of Gaza have been destroyed, including entire villages, refugee camps, towns, and cities that have been or are deliberately being rendered uninhabitable. Israel has made a humanitarian response impossible with constant bombardment, including of safe routes. 1. 9 million people, nearly 85% of the population, are displaced, including elderly, wounded and disabled people, living in makeshift tents, lacking any or adequate sanitation and water, in United Nations schools and with relatives. The entire population is facing starvation. 93% of the population in Gaza is facing crisis levels of hunger, with more than 1 in 4 facing catastrophic conditions with death imminent. Against that background, the Israeli Prime Minister asserted on the 25th of December, 2023, "We are not stopping, we are continuing to fight and we are deepening the fighting in the coming days, and this will be a long battle and it is not close to being over." The circumstances could not be more urgent. 143. The 2.3 million Palestinians in Gaza, including over 1 million children, are extremely vulnerable. There is a grave threat to their existence. They are in urgent and severe need of the court's protection. With each passing day that Israel's military attacks continue, further significant loss of life and property is being caused, and grave human rights violations are being committed. There can be no doubt that the requirements for the indication of provisional measures are satisfied here. Provisional measures requested. 144. On the basis of the facts set forth above, South Africa, as a state party to the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, respectfully requests the Court, as a matter of extreme urgency, pending the Court's determination of this case on the merits, to indicate the following provisional measures in relation to the Palestinian people as a group protected by the Genocide Convention. These measures are directly linked to the rights that form the subject matter of South Africa's dispute with Israel. 1. The State of Israel shall immediately suspend its military operations in and against Gaza. 2. The the State of Israel shall ensure that any military or irregular armed units which may be directed, supported, or influenced by it, as well as any organizations and persons which may be subject to its control, direction, or influence, take no steps in furtherance of the military operations referred to point 1 above. 3. The Republic of South Africa and the State of Israel shall each, in accordance with their obligations under the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, in relation to the Palestinian people, take all reasonable measures within their power to prevent genocide. 4. The State of Israel shall, in accordance with its obligations under the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, in relation to the Palestinian people as a group protected by the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, desist from the commission of any and all acts within the scope of Article 2 of the Convention, in particular a. Killing members of the group, b. Causing serious bodily or mental harm to the members of the group, c. Deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, and d. Imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. 5. The State of Israel shall, pursuant to point 4 c above, in relation to Palestinians, desist from, and take all measures within its power including the rescinding of relevant orders, of restrictions, and/or of prohibitions to prevent a. The expulsion and forced displacement from their homes, b. The deprivation of I. Access to adequate food and water, 2. Access to humanitarian assistance, including access to adequate fuel, shelter, clothes, hygiene and sanitation, 3. Medical supplies and assistance, and c. The destruction of Palestinian life in Gaza. 6. The State of Israel shall, in relation to Palestinians, ensure that its military, as well as any irregular armed units or individuals which may be directed, supported, or otherwise influenced by it and any organizations and persons which may be subject to its control, direction or influence, do not commit any acts described in 4 and 5 above, or engage in direct and public incitement to commit genocide, conspiracy to commit genocide, attempt to commit genocide, or complicity in genocide. And insofar as they do engage therein, that steps are taken towards their punishment pursuant to Articles 1, 2, 3 and 4 of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. 7. The State of Israel shall take effective measures to prevent the destruction and ensure the preservation of evidence related to allegations of acts within the scope of Article 2 of the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. To that end, the State of Israel shall not act to deny or otherwise restrict access by fact-finding missions, international mandates and other bodies to Gaza to assist in ensuring the preservation and retention of said evidence. 8. The State of Israel shall submit a report to the court on all measures taken to give effect to this order within 1 week, as from the date of this order, and thereafter at such regular intervals as the court shall order, until a final decision on the case is rendered by the court. 9. The State of Israel shall refrain from any action and shall ensure that no action is taken which might aggravate or extend the dispute before the court or make it more difficult to resolve. 145. The provisional measures requested are directly linked to the rights which form the subject matter of the dispute. In particular, the first 6 provisional measures have been requested to ensure TRAC's compliance with TS obligations under TH Genocide Convention not for engage in genocide, and to prevent and to punish genocide, as well as to uphold and reaffirm TH rights and obligations of South Africa to prevent genocide, and to protect Palestinians in Gaza from destruction. The last the provisional measures requested at aimed at protecting the integrity of proceedings before the court and South Africa's right to have his claim fairly adjudicated inching by ensuring the preservation of evidence. 146. South Africa respectfully requests that his request for provisional measures be considered urgently, at court's earliest possible opportunity, including the scheduling of a hearing in person or remotely by video LNK in the week of January 2024. 147. South Africa reserves its right to request additional provisions measures to prevent irreparable harm to rights assumed in his case, and to prevent further aggravation of dispute between he parties, should they become necessary, during the course of these proceedings. Reservation of rights. 148. South Africa reserves the right to revise, supplement or amend the terms of this application, as well as grounds invoke. Appointment of agent. 149. South Africa has designated as its agent His Excellency Ambassador Vasemuzi Philemon Madonsela, Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary of the Republic of South Africa to the Kingdom of Netherlands. 150. Pursuant to Article 40, Paragraph 1, of the Rules of Court, all communications relating to this case should be sent to Embassy of Republic of South Africa. 40 Wassenaarse 25961. The Hague, the Netherlands 151. I have the honor to assure the court of my highest esteem and consideration.